Hello and welcome to the Microsoft Azure Virtual Training Day. My name is Laurent Bugnon. I'm a cloud advocate with Microsoft, and I'm going to talk to you about modernizing .NET applications. This is quite an exciting module. We are going to see how you can basically take an existing web application. It's an old school ASP.NET 3.5 web application and migrate it to the cloud. We are going to have different steps. We are going to see also some demos, things like, for example, migrating the application step by step, first the web application, then the data. Then we are going to talk also about securing your application, about using custom domains, about using certificates to have TLS SSL enabled for HTTPS. And finally, we'll also talk about monitoring the web application so that you can be prepared for really any eventuality. So that should be quite exciting. In the current module, we are going to talk about assessing the migration. This is what you do before you even start, and that's going to give you peace of mind because beforehand you're going to know what you should expect during the migration. So this is assessing your migration, and in here we are going to talk about giving you peace of mind. So let's get started first with the drivers to migration and really what is motivating you, usually what is motivating most people really to move to the cloud. So the very first thing is maybe your data center contracts are going to expire. And it's a good time to ask yourself, what do I want to do in the future with my data and my applications? Do I want to continue with a data center contract that I need to maybe renegotiate, or do I want to really move things to the cloud and have, of course, all the advantages of a modern cloud provider with monitoring and with the scale up, scale down and everything? Maybe you have acquired a firm or you have been acquired and you end up with very hybrid solutions. You can maybe have some SQL data cohabitating with non-SQL data, and maybe you have some .NET applications cohabitating with some Node.js applications, for example. And that can be quite complicated to manage if you're on your own premise. Maybe you need to buy new servers and you need to advance the money, and that can be a problem. So on the other hand, if you go on Azure, of course, we have all those solutions ready for you, including some communication possibilities between both. Maybe you need some capacity. Maybe you need to, you are very successful with your product and you need to scale up, scale down, or scale out, scale in. We'll talk about the differences later. And you know how it is, right? If you need to buy a new server, you have to advance the money. It's going to take weeks until the server arrives. And then you have to set it up. You have to configure it. It's quite a lot of work. On the other hand, if you're on Azure, if you have capacity needs, we'll just give you the needs. And more importantly, what are you going to do when the demand disappears? Because maybe it's the holidays or maybe it's evening and people don't visit your site anymore, or at least not as much as you would want. And that's, of course, on Azure, not a problem at all, because there you can also scale down or scale in very easily. And since you pay for what you actually consume, it means that you're going to save money. Software, hardware refresh, this is a big one because on Azure you're always on the latest version, especially if you go with solutions like platform as a service or software as a service. We will define those terms later. Security threats, Azure is secure by default. Of course, you can always be more secure, and we have all the tools to monitor your application, to make sure that it is secure and to make it even better. Compliance is a big one, of course. I do live in Europe, and here we have things like GDPR and things like that. On Azure, we have tools. We also have all our services are compliant with a lot of different standards. Application innovation is one that I particularly like because as a developer, I like that I can have my main application running pretty much untouched, and then around it, I can add services. Things like, for example, serverless solutions if you want to add APIs in a very easy manner, but without touching your main web server. Or maybe cognitive services so that you can have artificial intelligence, and like this, you can enhance your application, but again, without touching it. And finally, software end of support. Maybe you know the Windows Server 2008 or SQL Server 2008. Those are out of support, and it could be a good driver for you to migrate. So the migration journey always has the same phases, more or less, the same stages, if you will. And in here, we are going to talk about assessing the migration itself. Things like, this is when you start thinking about cost, right? Like, how much is it going to cost for me to migrate to the cloud? This is when you want to prepare also your stakeholders, your users, but also your employees, because things are going to be slightly different. Then we'll do the migration itself. We'll see that we have different tools, for example, Azure Migrate or Azure Site Recovery, and we'll do the migration itself. We'll do it in 2 stages. We'll have the web application first, then the data. Maybe you also want to migrate other things, and that's okay. We have the tools to help you with that. And then you can optimize your application, because when your application runs well, that's the best time to take a break and then to think about how can I make it run even better in terms of performance, of course, but also in terms of cost management, saving costs. And again, we have the tools to help you with that. And finally, but not least, secure and managing your application. This is when you want to monitor it. This is when you want to be alerted if something goes wrong, because you don't want to know on Monday mornings that your application was down for the weekend, all right? You want to be immediately notified so that you can fix the problem. And of course, security is on top of everyone's mind. This has to be business as usual. This has to be something that you do all the time. So here we are in the assess phase. And so let's talk about what we are going to see in this session. First of all, we will prepare for the migration. We will talk about the different things that you can do before even assessing the migration. Like, what do you need to think about? How do you need to prepare your team? And then we'll talk about Azure Migrate. This is our big migration hub. This is where you can migrate things like virtual desktop, of course, virtual machines, Databox. We'll talk very quickly more about that. It's a physical solution to move your data to the cloud. And of course, what is really the main point of this session, moving your web application and moving your data. We will talk about assessing the migration. We'll see a really cool tool called the App Service Migration Assistant. This is what you will use to do the assessment of your web application. We'll see if we need to modify something in the web application before we even start moving. Then we'll talk about assessing the database, and here we'll use another tool called the Data Migration Assistant. And again, I'll show you a demo about that and all the details. And this is where we will see if we need maybe to modify our database slightly so that it runs better in the cloud. And then finally, because this is a course about .NET, and because I'm a developer, I also want to talk to you about modernizing your .NET application. So if you have an ASP.NET, for example, like in the demo 3.5, a very old version of ASP.NET, and you want to modernize it to .NET Core, that might be a little bit tricky, but we have tools to help you, for example, the Portability Analyzer, and we also have some recommendations. So before you even migrate, there are a few things that you want to discuss with your team and with your stakeholders. And really what you need to understand is that Azure is a collection of services, and you can literally build an application, for example, a little bit like you build Legos. You know, you take pieces, you combine them together, you have a big piece, a small piece, and then at the end they create a beautiful creation. And that's a little bit the same thing with Azure. We have all those services that you can combine together. And, you know, many people start by taking their web server or their SQL server, they do a virtual machine image with that, and then they just move it to the cloud, and that's okay. But we also have other options, and this is what I want to talk to you about with Platform as a Service. So in the discovery and assessment phase, this phase is super important. This is really, I would say, the key to the success. And my colleague Sarah Lynn, who helped me prepare those slides, is a specialist in porting and migrating applications to the cloud. And she always says the same thing: you need to sit down first, you know, quietly, calmly, and then assess your migration. Because this is a phase where you're going to discover everything that your application relies on. And it's very important that you document everything, that you keep track of everything, and that you don't forget a dependency, because otherwise you're going to start the migration and suddenly you're going to see, oh, I forgot that service which needs absolutely to be configured, and that's going to take time. And really during the migration you want to be as straightforward as possible. Now this is also a phase where you're going to train your staff. All right, and of course, you need to understand that for your staff, it's going to be different in the cloud. They will have other responsibilities. Maybe the way that they work is going to change slightly. Maybe some people are going to discover a new profession, all right, and they need to get ready for it. So you want to train them, you want to help them, knowing what to expect and also really getting ready for it. And this is really where I want to encourage them, to train them, to show them Microsoft Learn, where we have so many free modules so that they can train themselves and get ready. But also your end users, all right? In an ideal world, nothing would change for them and they would still continue to be very happy with the application, but maybe some things are going to change slightly, all right? And maybe this is where you can also take advantage of the feedback they gave you so that you can modernize your application and maybe even, start changing things to make them happy. Maybe it's not the best time to change things just before the migration though. So maybe this is something that you want to do in stages, but again, it's a great time where you can do the planning for that and really get ready for it. And I already mentioned that, but really documentation, very critical part of this phase. You want to keep everything down so that you can go back to it. Like, why did we take this decision? Was it a good decision? It's okay to challenge your decisions, but it's even better if you remember why you took the decision in the first place. So connect everything, document everything, and make sure that you keep track of all that. Now, of course, in this stage, we are also going to talk about cost. And a good thing to do is start by assessing like how much does it currently cost, all right? And it's a little bit complicated because there are a lot of moving parts here. First of all, maybe you bought some servers and you are still amortizing them. Maybe you need some new server, or you would need some new server to stay current and to stay on premise, and so you need to take that in account. But also, of course, you want to know how much it's going to cost in the cloud. And of course, you need to understand that in the cloud, things work a little bit differently. You're not going to advance the money in the cloud. You're going to pay as you go. This is an operational expenditure model as opposed to the capital expenditure model, where really you go and buy hardware and then you need to advance the money for that. And it's really hard when you're on premise to know what kind of hardware you need because you cannot really plan the future, okay? So in the cloud, you're going to do estimations because as you pay as you go, you cannot know in the beginning of the month how much exactly you're going to pay, but you can estimate, and we have a lot of tools for that. The first tool that I want to recommend you is what we call the TCO, the Total Cost of Ownership Calculator. And this is at this URL. You can go there and you can build a report. You're going to say, this is what I have on premise right now. I have this database, I have this capacity, I have this compute power, I have this bandwidth, etc., etc. And then the TCO is going to help you to calculate an equivalent cost and to estimate what is going to cost you in the cloud. We also have the pricing calculator, and the pricing calculator takes a slightly different approach. It's going to help you to build your application. You remember the Lego analogy of the beginning, and to say, all right, if you use this, for example, serverless function, and you put them in Switzerland in the data center, and you have so many calls and you have so much capacity, that's what it's going to cost you. That's an estimate, of course. And then if you decide to take the same application with the same conditions exactly, but move it to Western Europe, maybe that area is slightly less expensive for some reason, maybe because we have, for example, more capacity or something. And then you can estimate how much it's going to cost you. So the pricing calculator is going to help you run some scenarios and some estimates and have a better idea of how much your move to the cloud is going to cost you on the long term. The migration phase, let's talk about it. A few hints, and again, this is my colleague Sarah Lynn who helped me prepare this. She's really an expert, and she says you shouldn't start with your most important workload. And it's kind of a no-brainer, really. You want to get started with something which is not critical to your business, because this is the phase where you're going to learn about the migration, all right? And so when you start, driving a car, you don't go on the highway immediately, right? You start on small roads where nobody can see you and where, most importantly, you cannot hurt anybody, especially not yourself. And so here it's exactly that. You don't want to hurt yourself. So start with a small workload. Maybe you have a small internal tool that is well suited to do a migration, and you will learn a lot during this migration that you can then apply when you do the actual migration of your most important workload. Communication is key, all right? We don't say it enough. The communication is critical, especially between your IT pro and your developers, because maybe the developers will want to try new features when they are in the cloud, and then the IT pro need to know about it so that they can prepare themselves. The migration itself is going to affect everyone, so have team meetings where you go to the point where you talk about it. Maybe even better than team meetings, share documents where you write everything that you do and where people can consult and can modify things. All right, this is really a good management idea. Managing, monitoring, setting up backup, disaster recovery, those are all things that the cloud is going to offer you in a very easy manner. So setting up a backup, for example, well, for a SQL Server, it's pretty much automated, so you don't really need to do anything there. But maybe you want to set disaster recovery, and maybe you want to have a secondary region, for example, where your data is kept. Like this, if there is a disaster in one region, which of course we don't hope, but things happen, then you can always go back to the backup, which is running in a totally different region, and recover your data. Monitoring is critical, and this is something that we do a lot on Azure. We have a lot of tools for that. I'll talk to you about that in the 5th module of this learning path. We have Azure Monitor, managing your application. So this is really what you do during this phase. And then maybe you can reconsider some design choices. Why not? This is when your application runs well. So maybe you can say, how can I make it run even better? It is secure by default, but maybe I can make it even more secure. Do I really need to have, I don't know, the firewall with those ports open? Can I close them? Can I use, I don't know, an express route if I want to have a hybrid connection to my data, etc., etc. So you have a lot of options. In the optimization phase, now, optimizing your application and optimizing especially the performance at this stage and of course the cost, this is really a business as usual activity, or at least it should become one. This is something that you do continuously all the time. It should be top of mind. How can my application run even better, and how can it save me money? And again, we have tools for that. All right, I'll talk to you about that when we talk about migrating the data, for example, in module 3 of this learning path. We'll talk about optimizing your queries, your SQL queries. We'll talk about getting some recommendations on how to do that. We'll talk about cost management and how to optimize it. And here again, you can get some recommendations on how to do that. Tracking, understanding your cost trend, this is of course very important. You want to do that. You want to know where your money is going. You want to know how much you're going to pay at the end. This is exactly where you see some silly things like, oh no, somebody forgot to turn a virtual machine, which is very expensive. And why don't you go and set up, for example, auto shutdown on those virtual machines? You can say that every evening at 6 p.m., for example, the machine is going to shut down. And like this, you go into the night knowing that you don't have a machine like costing you money for no benefit at all. And this is also, of course, where you can do your operations run even better, where you can optimize the roles. For example, you can, continuously train your staff. This is super important. Continuous training is very, very important. The security is also a business as usual activity. And here again, this is something that should be always top of mind. You continuously, as soon as you have, a public port open somewhere, somebody is going to try to attack it. So you want to secure that. You want to make sure that you don't have leaks, that you don't have any problem. And here too, we have tools and we have recommendations for you. So we'll see that also. For example, when we talk about the data migration in module 3, also in module 4, when we talk about securing the application, using TLS certificates, etc. Everybody should know their responsibility. Azure works very much with a role-based access control, and so you can really define that some people have different roles when it comes to Azure, and like this, they will know what they need to do. They can train themselves specifically for that, in addition to the general training, and then they also have a more secure access to that. Staff training, of course, I already mentioned that. Keep training your users and your staff all the time. So the Azure Migration Center, this is where we will get started. It's azure.com/migrate if you want to have really the shorthand. We have guidance, we have tools, we also have partners, and we are going to help you recognize what you need and how you can get better into doing those migrations. So without further ado, I want to show you a demo, and in here we are going to assess the migration, and we are going to start by assessing the web application migration, but then later we will also assess the data migration. So here we start in the Azure portal, and of course, very much of what I'm going to do here, you could also do with a script or with a console application, with the Azure command line integration, for example. Let's start by creating a new resource, and we are going to create a resource group. The resource group is basically where you group everything that you have in your application. Like this, you can manage and find everything. Creating a resource group is like creating any other resource in Azure. You're going to have to define a few things, like the subscription where you want to be built, give it a name, and then you're going to select a region. In that case, I'm going to put things in Western Europe, which is closer to my user. All right, we are going to create that. It's just going to take a few seconds to be created. We go to the resource group, and of course, we see that at the moment it's going to be empty. We still don't have anything into that. So let's go back to the marketplace, and we are going to add something called Azure Migrate this time. Now, Azure Migrate is a little bit a special type of resource. It's actually what we call a hub. This is where you're going to collect every migration assessment that you're going to do. Like this, you can document it, and then you can find it very easily. So here you see the Azure Migrate Hub. You see that you can also migrate multiple things, not just web application and database. For example, servers, all right? If you have a virtual machine that you want to migrate to the cloud, we are going to help you with that. Virtual desktop can get migrated as well. And also Databox, which is kind of a fun way, or at least an interesting way to move your application to the cloud in a physical manner. For example, if you have a lot of data and you don't want to rely on a slow internet, or if this is very, very sensitive data and you want to move it in a more secure manner without relying on the public internet. So in this session, we talk about the web application. So let's click here. And then as you can see, we have a Migrate project already, but I really would like to start with a brand new project. So I'm going to create a new Migrate project. And I'm going to create one. Here we go. And in order to create the project, again, same type of dialog, the subscription, the resource group. Let's give it a name. We are going to call that Rewards Migrate. Rewards being the name of the application that we are going to migrate. And here we don't select a region per se, but we select a geography. Okay, that's going to influence a few things during the migration. Cool, so we create this new project. As you can see, it's quite fast. And now under web application, we have some tools recommendations. For example, the App Service Migration Assistant. And here you see the two phases, the assessment first and then the migration. And here for the web application, we are actually going to use the same tool. So let's go to the website where we can learn more about this tool. As you can see, this is a public-facing website. Now, interestingly, if you have a URL which is public, you can enter it here, and we are going to do a quick assessment for you as a first idea of what's going on. So here, I don't have actually a public domain name for the rewards application yet, but I'm going to just type Tailwind Traders, which is our other application, our public-facing web store. And now, funnily enough, it's actually already running on Azure. And so, of course, everything is green because migrating an Azure application to another Azure application is very easy. So there is no questions here that this is going to work. But if you have another website which has a public-facing URL, you can enter it here and have really a quick assessment to see what you're dealing with. So let's go back and download this time the tool itself. Notice that you can use it for .NET, but also for PHP application. And now this is the tool installed. It's actually running as an application. And here you saw IIS, so this is basically the web server on which the application is running. I'm just going to go to localhost to see the application running on my premise, on my own server. This is the application. It's a rewards management application for Tailwind Traders. This is where we are going to keep track of your order history, maybe give you some coupons and some advantages, some benefits. You can navigate to another client. This is what you see. It's powered by ASP.NET and SQL Server. So let's go back to the tool, and first of all, we are going to just take a quick look at the application itself. So as you can see, this is actually a web forms application. Now, web forms is an old technology, but it is very, or at least it was very popular. As you can see here, it's running on .NET Framework 3.5, an old version of .NET, extremely popular, and this is why we actually allow you to run those old applications on Azure directly. But before we know if we need to change something, let's do the assessment. So here I selected the default website, and as you can see, we have one error. Now, this error would prevent us from actually running this web application to the cloud. It's a configuration thing. So let's go to IIS. And here, as you see, we have a lot of documentation explaining to you what is going on here and why you need to change it. It's because the identity of the application here is running as local system, which of course on Azure is not allowed. So we are going to have to change that. So we go to the application pools. Let's take the default application pool. I'm going to change it to something which is compatible with what Azure is actually offering. And this is here from local system, which Azure doesn't have, to application pool identity. All right. Now I'm changing the server configuration to make it more compatible with Azure. And now it would be a good time to actually try things out, test your application thoroughly so that you are sure that this change doesn't affect the way that the application runs. As you can see, now we have success, all right? So everything that was tested is actually compatible with Azure. So that's cool. Here you can also go and find a partner if you need it. So that's good, but what we want to do now is keep track of this assessment, and we are going to save it into Azure Migrate. So I'm going to log into Azure using here this code which was set up by the tool. Like this, basically it's going to link Microsoft Azure to the tool. And of course we have the small authentication dance, like I call it. Now we are authenticated, and as you can see, after a quick wait, we are going to be able to say, all right, I want to select the Azure Migrate project in which I want to save this assessment report. This is the one that we just created. And then we upload everything. Now at this point, this is where we will stop the demo, because the next step would be to do the actual migration. We are not quite there yet. This is a topic of the next module, which is coming after that. But here what we can do is go back to the Azure portal. All right, let's go to Azure Migrate. And here, if I refresh, now we will see the migration assessment has been uploaded. We have discovered one web server, we have assessed it, and then we have recommendations also for the next step. So everything is kept and everything is easy for you to consult in the cloud. All right, so now we have assessed the web application migration. Let's go to the next demo. And in this demo, we are going to assess the SQL Server. So here, this is a SQL Server which is running on-premise. All right, this is SQL Server Management Studio with a local database. And this is here the server view. So you see that it is running here in a VM which is really on-premise. And what we are going to do now is do the assessment of this. And in order to assess that, we are going to do the same thing as before using Azure Migrate. But first of all, let's take a quick look at the database. It's a very small database, but everything runs the same. If you have a big database as well, it's just going to take longer. As you can see, small database, so that allows us, again, right, this is a non-critical workload. It allows us to really try things out with a lot of peace of mind and make sure that when we migrate the critical workload, that we don't have a problem. So let's go to the database section. All right. As you can see, the project is already selected. This is good. We can keep it. And now we want to add an assessment tool. And as you can see, we have different choices. Now we are going to migrate a SQL Server, which is relatively recent. So we can take here the free tool, the Azure Migrate Database Assessment Tool. Let's go and add this tool in Azure Migrate, but we also have choice for you. And so if you prefer a third party that you already know how to use, for example, you're absolutely free to do that. All right, so now we have created that. This is cool. We can go and see what Azure Migrate is offering us. And again, we have those two phases, the assessment first and the migration second. We can download the Data Migration Assistant, and the Data Migration Assistant can run anywhere and then connect to your database. Here, I'm just going to put it on the same machine, on the same virtual machine. It's quite easy this way to find the database, of course. The Data Migration Assistant is an application, a desktop application, just like the App Service Migration Assistant that we saw before. And notice that it can also, in theory, be used for migration itself, not just for the assessment. We don't really recommend using that tool for the migration because it's only for small workloads. So if you have a bigger workload, if you want to migrate in a managed manner, then the database migration service, which is the one we are going to use in module 3, is actually more appropriate. So we do the assessment. We are going to give it here a project name, all right? We just call it rewards migrate data, for example. We are going to assess the database engine. The source is a SQL Server. You can also assess something which is running in AWS if you want to migrate that to Azure. And then we have different targets. We have Azure SQL Database single instance, but we also have SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machine if you want that, or SQL Server on-premise if you want to do a migration from a SQL Server to another SQL Server. We also have Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, and here I will talk more about that in Module 3. It's like running SQL Server in the cloud if you want. It has added compatibility even with very old version of SQL Server. It also has only private IP, so it is really an enterprise solution. It's also more expensive. So I'm going to start by assessing the single instance, which is really the most cost-effective solution that we have. And I'm going to test database compatibility, but also feature parity. Let's start the assessment. I need to connect, of course, to my source SQL Server. We are going to use SQL Server authentication with username and password. And of course, the tool needs to have access to the database. Now it finds out that it has one database, which I'm going to assess. All right. And then we can actually start the assessment. It's going to go quite fast. And we are going to see that here in that case, we actually have some compatibility issues, or rather some feature parity issues, I should say. For example, Service Broker is not supported in Azure SQL Database, as well as the encryption key management. And here, this is a step where you have to ask yourself, do I need those features in Azure SQL Database? If you need them absolutely for your application to run, then maybe you need to upgrade to an Azure SQL Database managed instance. But the good thing is that you know in advance. All right. Now, at this point, I decide that I don't need those features for my application to run. Okay, so I can go to an Azure SQL Database single instance. I don't have compatibility issues. And so now I can go, and again, we are going to upload the assessment report to Azure Migrate. So again, I need to do the authentication dance directly in the tool. All right, I'm going to sign in with my password. My password happens to be bullet, like I guess everybody else. That's great. Let's go and sign in. And because I have multi-factor authentication on Azure, which is really a kind of a basic thing to do to have added security, then you see that I'm using my phone to connect. And then eventually the report will be updated. So we are going to select the subscription where you want to update that. And then in this subscription, if you remember from before, I have two Azure Migrate projects. So let's take it. All right, rewards migrate. The assessment has been uploaded. So now I have everything in one location. I can go back to the Azure portal. And if I refresh, you will see that we have the assessment has been saved properly and we have everything we need. So the next step will be to do the actual migration. But before we do that, that will be in the next module. Before we do that, I really would like to talk to you about your .NET version, because we saw that it is an old version of .NET. It's a web forms application running ASP.NET 3.5. Maybe it's time to think about, well, do I want to modernize that a little bit? And of course, where we are investing a lot of effort and a lot of also rewards at the moment is .NET Core. Rewards because we have incredible performance with .NET Core. Also because it's running on Windows and on Linux. So let's compare those two. And we are going to compare .NET Classic, which is, .NET 3.5 is considered very classic. In fact, it's pretty old. But even things like ASP.NET 4.7, 4.8, this is a classic version of .NET, all right? As well as, of course, ASP.NET 3.5. Now, on .NET Core, we actually support on Azure ASP.NET Core 2.1 and 3.1, so the latest versions always. On the classic side, we do support 4.7 and 4.8, but we also support 3.5 because, again, this was a very, very popular version of .NET, and we know that there are a lot of workloads out there which run that. So we decide to still support that. Major difference, .NET Classic runs on Windows only, and we all know that Windows servers, they have great advantages, they have great benefits and features, but they do cost a little bit more, and so this is why some people prefer really to run things on Linux, or maybe that most of the web these days runs on Linux servers, and we do support Linux servers on Azure, so why not take advantage of them for your .NET application by using .NET Core? That would be a great move into great performance, but also, cost optimization. So I would say .NET Classic, if you have an existing application and you don't have the bandwidth and the personnel to actually migrate it to .NET Core, then it's fine. We have you covered. You can still migrate it and run it. But if you are running a new application, or if you want to migrate your existing application and get basically added value, then I would recommend considering a migration on .NET Core. If you start a new application from scratch, there is no question you should train your staff and then allow them to use .NET Core instead, because this is really where the innovation lies at the moment. Performance enhancements, I already mentioned that, but really .NET Core is very fast. It's way faster than, for example, Node.js, okay? So think about it. The migration path for a .NET to .NET Core migration would be, just like with everything else, assessing the migration. And here we have a tool. It's called the .NET Portability Analyzer. I will show you a demo in a few seconds. One thing that you can do to get ready, that's always a good step, is to take your business logic and put it in .NET standard libraries, okay? So like this, you have class libraries which are compatible with .NET Classic, but also compatible with .NET Core. And like this, you can run your unit test on your business logic, and you can make sure that porting it to .NET Standard has not affected the way that it runs. So it's a good place to have basically just a thin shell of ASP.NET Classic, the UI shell, maybe a few things that you really cannot port yet because you don't have the time to do it. But really, most of your business logic can probably run in .NET Standard already, so it's a good step. And finally, sit down, relax, and enjoy the performance improvements that .NET Core is bringing you. So let's see a demo and how you can use the .NET Portability Analyzer to assess your .NET to .NET Core migration. So we will go in Visual Studio, all right? This is the application that we saw before. It's this .NET Framework 3.5 application. It's a web forms application, pretty old, but of course it has served us very well, I guess .NET 3.5 is really years and years old, right? But it has over the years served us well, so we want to really take care of it. So the .NET Portability Analyzer is an extension. And here you see that I already installed it. If you don't have it yet, you can go into the online section here, and then you just type Portability Analyzer, it's going to find it. Once you have installed it, it shows up as a new menu. I'm going to go into my binary source for this website, and then I'm going to select the DLLs that I want to assess. The assessment is saved as an Excel file, and then you can go and open the Excel file. It's going to basically run through all the APIs that you are using, all the .NET APIs, and it's going to tell you which ones are okay to get migrated and which ones are not supported. So let's go and open the Excel file. Here we go. You see that I have a fair score. If I wanted to go to .NET Core, I have something like between 65 and 72% compatibility depending on what version I choose, all right? So this is not bad, but let's see and get better, and especially let's see what is not supported. So here you see the detail, and really for every single .NET class that you are using, we have an assessment. And for example, here we see that this particular class is supported on .NET Standard versions 1.6 and higher. So this is great because it means that we can probably move our web forms application to .NET 4.7, and then after that we can move this particular usage of this class to a .NET Standard assembly, and like this we take a good step towards .NET Core. Now, unsurprisingly, some things are not supported. For example, the web forms UI, all right, system.web.ui.web controls. Well, okay, we don't have that in .NET Core, so this is something that you're going to work on and possibly isolate it first, and then after that change it to something else. So the process, if we recap, we are going to take a monolithic ASP.NET Web Forms app. We are going to move the classes, the business classes, to a .NET Standard class library, and then we are going to stay with a thin layer of ASP.NET Web Forms, but this thin layer is going to be easy to migrate to 4.7, like this you have the latest, and then later you can replace the thin layer with something else which is .NET Core compatible, for example, Razor Pages. All right, we also have classes which are not supported right now, things like HTTP requests in system.web, for example, .NET Core Web. For example, .NET Core, we use something like HTTP client to do these kind of things. It's more efficient, it's faster, it's really recommended. So by doing this assessment, you're going to learn a lot about your application, and you're also going to see how you can make it even better for your users. So hopefully this demo and the other demos that I made were helpful. So let's review quickly what we saw in this module. First of all, we have actually prepared for the migration, and we have seen how you can take care of your staff, take care of your users, collect feedback, document everything, train them, all right? Basically, get ready for the phase because things are going to change when you go to Azure and you want to be prepared. We talked about Azure Migrate, all right? This is our hub for migration. This is where you can migrate, virtual machines to a server. You can migrate virtual desktop. You can migrate data, web application, and even Databox, a physical way to migrate applications to the cloud. We have migrated the web application using the App Service Migration Assistant. All right, this is a tool that we have which is going to help you to migrate in a managed way. But right now we have just done the assessment so that we know that the migration is possible. We saw that we had a small error. We fixed it. We checked if the application is still running fine with the application pool identity being changed. And now we know that our application is ready to run in Azure. We did the assessment for the database, and here we use a data migration assistant, which is another tool. If you have other database system, we have different tools, but again, Azure Migrate is going to help you to select the correct tool. We have uploaded all the reports to Azure Migrate so that we have one neat, single place, unique place where you can find out everything for traceability. This is very important. And then we took a small detour into .NET, and we talked about .NET to .NET Core assessment. We use a .NET Portability Analyzer, and I talked to you a little bit about architecture and how you can basically move your application to something a little bit more flexible so that later, if you want, you can move it to ASP.NET Core and then take advantage of all the performance enhancement and everything that we do around .NET Core at the time, including running your application on Linux. So call to action to you, it's a good time to continue learning. It's actually always a good time to keep learning. And here, if you go to aka.ms/mod10, you will see tutorials, samples. You will see links to the Azure Migration Center, which is, the Azure Migrate that I had mentioned a few times. You will also find links to Microsoft Learn modules, which are good to continue learning on your own. We also have in the Learn module some demos. You can do migrations in a sandbox so that you don't have to pay anything. You can really train your staff and get ready for the migration. Hopefully this session was useful for you, and of course continue learning on Microsoft Learn. So that was it for module 1. In this module, we talked about the assessment of the migration. This is what you do before you even get started with the actual migration. In the next module, this is where we are going to move the web application to App Service. This should be very exciting. So let's take a 10 minutes break, and I will see you after the break for module 2. Welcome back from the break. In this module, module 2 of this learning path, we are going to talk about the web application migration itself. And I'm going to show you quite a lot of things. We are going to talk about tools and also best practices to do the migration. You'll see also a demo, which is really about migrating the application itself and then configuring it. So that should be very exciting. Let's get started with module 2. So this here is about upgrading the web application to app services. We are going to actually physically move the application from your premise into Azure and into app services. And again, a quick reminder, there are a few reasons why people are migrating to the cloud. And we talked about that more in detail in the first session, so I'm not going back into every one of those points. But I want to mention specifically for web application, the application innovation that you can bring to your application into Azure is really fantastic. You can easily leave your web server untouched so that it runs perfectly fine, but then you add around it some services, for example, using serverless applications, using cognitive services for artificial intelligence and to add new things into your app. Or maybe you want to have a mobile backend, for example, so that you have a mobile companion for your web application, which again runs completely untouched. So this is really a good set of reasons to move into the cloud. And again, if we remember the migration journey, the 4 stages that I talked about in the first session, we are going now from assessment into the migration itself. Couple of recommendations that I want you to remember. Do the assessment first because this is your peace of mind. And also don't start with your most critical workload. You want to start with a small workload. Here in that case, you are migrating a rewards application. So it is a public facing application, but it is not as critical to Tailwind Traders' business as, for example, the main website, which is really public facing. So in Azure and at Microsoft in general, you know that we love developers, all right? We have famous videos of our former CEO who was, shouting developers, developers, developers. We love developers, but we also love IT pro, and we have tools for really everybody. For example, during the development phase, we have Visual Studio, all right? This is the king of IDEs, the integrated development environment where I spent really most of my professional career. I love this tool. It's getting better with every release. But if you have needs, for example, to develop on, let's say, a Mac or on Linux, we have Visual Studio Code. I even use Visual Studio Code on Windows, for example, to write text files, to write Markdown files, to run my blog. You can also create .NET applications using Visual Studio Code. So it is a very, very powerful development environment, but it is also more lightweight than Visual Studio. We also have code spaces, GitHub code spaces. Now, this is an exciting new opportunity that you have to run your development environment in the cloud, and then you connect to it either through a web browser with a UI, or you can even have a thin shell of Visual Studio. So you just install really the UI of Visual Studio. Like this, you have all, the shortcuts that you love, etc. But the environment itself is running into the cloud. And that allows you to very easily have multiple environments, for example, one for client if you're in the consulting business. So that's pretty cool. In the delivery phase, we have you covered. We have Azure DevOps, we have GitHub Actions. The difference in both is, sometimes a little bit confusing, but really what we can say is that GitHub Actions, we have a lot of investment going into GitHub Actions at the moment. You can do a lot of things. It's very comfortable. You have your actions, which are really a part of your repository. Azure DevOps is where we have a little bit more functionality at the moment. You have things like deployment gates, for example, etc. But basically what I'm trying to tell you here is that whatever you're trying to do and whatever environment you prefer, we have you covered. We also have tools to operate your application, and you know that once it is developed and deployed, this is when I would say the real work really starts, because this is where you want to monitor your application. We have Azure Monitor. We'll talk more about that in the 5th session of this learning path. We have automation systems. We have also the security center, because you really don't want hackers to access your users' data, to access your application, to cause trouble. And so you know that even the bigger firms have these kind of issues sometimes, and so the Azure Security Center is definitely going to help you to manage your security and to improve it. So in this session, we are going to have, again, a few phases and a few components. First of all, we are going to do the actual move, moving your web application to app services, all right? We are going to show you, once it is moved, how you can configure application telemetry. And we are going to use Application Insights for that, because it's a .NET application. Insight works also with JavaScript application, with Java applications, etc. In .NET, you have really a lot of features that you can monitor very easily without modifying your code. And then after that, we'll take advantage of platform as a service, and we'll use another service called Azure Key Vault to manage settings and secrets. And here you will see how you can hide your connection string, the SQL Server connection string, into a more secure place, and we'll understand why you want to do that. And finally, another big advantage of platform as a service, scaling up and scaling out. We'll understand the difference between both, and I'll show you a demo showing how you can configure automated scale out. You see that the difference can be confusing. Scaling out meaning that we are going to give you more servers if you need more demand. So now it is actually time to move. So where are we going to start and what are we going to do? First of all, let's consider the different hosting solutions that we have for web applications on Azure. And of course, starting with virtual machines. Now, very often, this is where people go when they think about migrating to the cloud. They think, I'm going to do what we call a lift and shift. We lift the VM, we shift it into the cloud. And of course, this is absolutely okay to do that, but you're going to you're going to need to take care of certain things, because virtual machines mean that you have more responsibility on your side. All right, so you have more control, but also more responsibility. We'll talk more about that in a moment, and especially the differences between IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, those as a service monikers. Now, another thing that I want you to know about is static web app on Azure Storage. Now, this is probably the easiest way to quickly set up a small website which is running only client-side pages, for example, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, but also images, videos, maybe even Blazor if you want to use, a very rich UI developed in .NET into your web application. And then you can totally host those files into Azure Storage. You turn on static web server, and then you can serve it. This is a great solution for very small websites, but maybe sometimes you want a little bit more power, and this is where the Azure Static Web Apps, which is currently in preview, comes in. Azure Static Web Apps, now this is really a very comfortable solution, again, for static web applications, so things like SPA, single page applications, where you have HTML, JavaScript, maybe a framework like Vue or like Angular or like React, etc., etc. You know that there are many JavaScript frameworks. And then you still want to have a little bit of a backend, especially in terms of APIs, HTTP APIs, and then you will implement those using Azure Functions, serverless Azure Functions. So this is quite an exciting opportunity that you have. Again, there is no web server per se, all right? You just have a serverless function application and your client-side page, which are communicating together. And as of recently, we also support .NET there, so it's not just for JavaScript developers. So this is quite interesting to develop your Azure Functions here. Finally, I would say the king of web application hosting on Azure, this is App Service. You can host applications with .NET, JavaScript, PHP, Java, and more. Here we will see in this demo how you do the migration to App Service. And then we'll take also a quick tour of the App Service to understand the features. So where do you start with the migration? Well, just like before, we started the assessment with the Azure Migrate Hub. This is also where you can start it for that. And as you saw earlier on, we had those two phases when we did the web application assessment. The next phase was the migration itself. And to do that, we are going to use a tool called the Azure App Service Migration Assistant. This is something that you are going to download, all right? So this is a download page that you can find. It's, an application that you installed. In my case, I installed it on the web server where my workload is running. And then I was able to do the assessment. But quickly about Azure Migrate, it's not just for web application, it's not just for VMs. You have over 12 migration tools that you can choose and manage in Azure Migrate. You can create projects like we did. You can access up to 35,000 servers in a single project. So that should be really a lot. And then you can always create an additional project if you need to. And you can migrate to the Azure regions, all right? We have very many global regions. In fact, it's hard to keep count. At the time, we have something like 60 plus Azure regions, and we keep adding new ones. So if you want to migrate something that you have on premise and move it, for example, to Switzerland, I'm based in Switzerland, and so I'm happy to know that we have data centers here. We have actually two regions in Switzerland, one in the west and one in the north. And so like this, you can have redundancy, you can have fallback, you can have all kinds of security around your data, and then keep your data in your region, which sometimes for compliance is necessary. So Azure Migrate, right, this is a hub. We already saw that in the first module earlier on. We are going to see it more in this session as well. So without further ado, let's go to migrating the web application. And again, I want to quickly remind you what application we are going to migrate. So this is an old ASP.NET 3.5 application. And it is running web forms, which is a very popular solution, but which is maybe a little bit obsolete. And we already talked about possibilities that you have to migrate to .NET Core, but we are not there yet now. First of all, we really want to move this to Azure. .NET 3.5, let's open here a page. You see that we have a lot of web forms content, web forms controls and everything. This is the application that we are going to migrate. You see that it is a rewards management application where you can manage orders for customers as well as coupons and rewards. And so when we went to Tailwind Traders and when we checked the application, one thing we noticed is that they have the SQL connection string saved in web config. Now, it's not really surprising because it was a very popular way to do things, but there are a few issues with that. For example, one issue is that this is probably going to end up in source control at some point, and you really don't want that because those are your secrets. So one thing we can do, we are going to modify that. Let's go to the data access handler. And here, this is where I get the connection string from the web config. But instead, I'm going to modify the code a little bit to allow me to retrieve the connection string from environment variables instead. And I have a fallback to the web config if I don't find things in environment variables. But like this is going to give me more flexibility, and it's going also to make it super easy to have different connection string depending on the environment. So now I can go back into the web config, I can remove the connection string. I probably want to purge GitHub from that file, from that string at least, so that nobody can find it. So now we are ready to do the migration in a better way, in a more secure way, and we'll understand a little bit later how we can save the connection string in an even more secure way. So here we go back to the Azure App Service Migration Assistant. This is where we stopped the previous demo because we have done the assessment and now we are ready for the migration itself. So we are going to select the subscription, the resource group. We still use the same rewards resource group. And then we select a name. Now this name needs to be unique worldwide because of course it's going to be a domain name. But notice that it is a working name only. And later we are going to configure also custom domain. We are going to select a region. Again, I'm based in Switzerland. I select here Western Europe, which is close to my users. And then we need to create or select an app service plan. In that case, I'm going to create a new one. App service plan is essentially defining how many resources you're going to have, how powerful your web server is going to be. It defines things like, for example, features that you have, if you want slots, etc. Here we are going to go with the default proposed app service plan. Now, one thing also we need to select is the database setup. And here we can skip it because my database actually has a public IP address. It has a public port open. So I can connect to it using the connection string in a hybrid manner. But if my database was private, I can set up hybrid connection, and that's going to allow you to establish a private connection to your database using the hybrid connection tool. All right, let's start the migration. In reality, it takes a few minutes, all right? So we are just going to wait a moment. And we will see eventually what happens and if the migration was successful. All right, seems that everything worked fine. This is great. So we can go and see what we did, and then we can start configuring the web application. But at this point, it seems to be already running in Azure, which is a good success. That's great. So let's go back to the resource group. I'm going to refresh and see what was created. We see the web application itself, the app service, as well as the app service plan. This is where you can manage all that. Let's go into the portal, into the app service. We are going to go to the configuration because right now, if you try to run it, you're going to have an error because the connection string is not in web config anymore. You need to set it up. So let's go here in the setting. I'm going to add the connection string. And then I just paste the connection string in clear text, which is, it's more secure than in the web config. It's not in GitHub, but at the same time, it means that every one of my developers will have access to that. And that can be maybe a little bit disturbing. We'll see later what we can do about that. I'm saving the configuration. It means that the application is going to restart, but it's all seamless. And now the application should run without a glitch because it finds the connection string. Let's see if we can actually make it run on Azure. All right, so this is, the main page. Notice that you can also configure deployment slots if you want to have, for example, a staging slot for your website and a production slot. So this is also part of the whole app service plan. Let's go and click on the URL. It goes into a new page. It takes a moment to load because it's the first run. And here we go. We have our application running. We can try it out. It seems to be running just fine. But this time, oh goodness, it is running on azurewebsites.net. So we have managed to do the migration into Azure. Seems that the connection to the database is running just fine as well. So basically, we are ready to continue configuring our application and to take advantage of platform as a service. So platform as a service as a concept means that we are going to, as a cloud provider, manage the platform. We are offering you a platform. We manage, for example, we make sure that you always have the latest security patches in .NET, that you have, your IIS is always patched and to the latest, that the operating system you're using is patched and virus-free and secured, etc. But you also have different options. And so let's review those options and talk about other things that you could do if you want to migrate into the cloud. So this is always about responsibility, and we talk in Azure, and usually cloud providers talk about the shared responsibility model. What it means is that if you are running your application and your network and your hardware on-premise, you are responsible for literally everything, all right? If something goes wrong, it's up to you to change it. If a server breaks and fails, you need to replace it. If your network breaks, you need to fix it, all right? So you're responsible for everything, but of course, you also have a lot of control. On the other hand, if you go to IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service, virtual machines, then you have here less responsibility because Microsoft, the cloud provider, is going to take care of the servers, the hardware, of the storage, again, the hardware storage, the networking, as well as the virtualization system. But everything up from that, the operating system itself, etc., is going to be in your responsibility. So that's a lot of responsibility, and it's something that you need to consider, which is why a lot of people prefer to move to platform as a service, PaaS, where Microsoft, the cloud provider, is going to be responsible also of the operating system. So you can choose Windows or Linux, but after that, we are going to keep you to the latest. We are going to patch it. We are going to secure it. It's also responsible for the middleware. For example, on Windows, it would be IIS, or maybe you have another server on Linux. It's also responsible for the runtime. In our case, it's .NET, it could be Node.js, etc., etc. And then you are really concentrating your effort on applications and data, which is really where your expertise is needed. Now, there is another possibility to run things on Azure or on Microsoft. It's SaaS, software as a service. For example, think about Office 365, right? You can have Microsoft Word running in the web browser, or Microsoft PowerPoint, or maybe Excel. And basically, we are here in charge of the application itself, in charge of the data, or at least the storing of the data and all that. You're still responsible to feed content into Word and PowerPoint and Excel, of course, but this is also another solution. Now, SaaS is typically what we call Office 365, Microsoft 365. But let's concentrate here on Azure with IaaS and PaaS. And here we decided to go with app services. It's really a pretty good choice, I would say, because it's going to give us quite a lot of benefits. So let's talk about that. First of all, you're going to have a very high productivity for your application. Things like choosing the frameworks that you want to run it on, right? .NET, Node.js, Java, Docker, PHP, Ruby, Python. And I mentioned Docker. Yes, it's true. You can deploy containers directly to app service. And this is a very neat way to run containers on Windows and on Linux, if it's a web application, specialized containers, without having to configure AKS, which would be more powerful, but also more complicated to manage. All right, so it's good to know that you can deploy containers directly to app service. Staging and deployment, I already mentioned that very quickly earlier on. You have deployment slots. So you can create a new slot for staging, and then you can, for example, set up an Azure DevOps continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline, which says, all right, I'm going to deploy to staging, and then I'm going to have a gated deployment to production so that somebody can test the staging and then can approve if yes or no we are going to go into production with that. Testing in production, now I know how scary that sounds, but again, we have tools for that. We have something, for example, called the snapshot debugger, and I'm going to talk more about that in the 5th session of this learning path. So if you want to know how to test in production in a very secure environment and very peace of mind, then you should join us in the 5th module at the end of this learning path. App Gallery Marketplace, let's say that you want to run WordPress on App Service, no problem, we have you covered. You go to the App Gallery and then you say, I want to run WordPress. It's going to create everything for you, install it, and then you just have to manage your CMS. We have, of course, a lot more applications than that. It is managed, so you're going to be able to do auto scale. We'll see a demo about that later. But also things like load balancing, if you want to have multiple regions for your website, and multiple servers, and then we have a load balancer for you, for example, Azure Front Door. We'll talk about that in the 4th session of this learning path. It has high availability. We patch automatically if there are some security issues, etc. Cost, all right, we talked about the cost management. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. And backup and recovery, which is always good for peace of mind. It's also enterprise ready. Okay, your data can be global. We have 60 plus regions that you can go to. Hybrid support, definitely we know that most of the solutions that our customers are using are hybrid in a way, where maybe you have some data on premise, some in the cloud, maybe the application in the cloud and the SQL Server on premise. Azure Active Directory, all right, this is very important to secure your application and to have something like role-based access control for your app. This is super easy to do with Azure Active Directory and also extremely powerful for everything you have on Azure. And finally, of course, security and compliance. So let's talk about deployment options, because you really have a number of ways to bring your application into the cloud. And so here we have started by doing a migration, meaning that, the app service migration assistant went to take the code, moved it as is into Azure and ran it. But of course, later you want to have some kind of continuous deployment option where you can continue to work on your application, modify it where necessary, and then have a continuous deployment. And this is exactly what right-click publish is not, all right? So don't get confused. Right-click publish is a feature that you have in Visual Studio. My DevOps friends are very much against it. It's not managed, all right? But it is sometimes convenient, and let's face it, as a developer, I think everybody did a right-click deploy, right-click publish at some point. So you can literally deploy from Visual Studio to Azure. Major issues with that is that it's not actually going to scale, all right? If you want to deploy multiple times during the day, it's going to be a little bit troublesome. Also, it's not automated, so it's more difficult to reproduce exactly how it is running. All right, so that's the main issue that you have here. So you have other options. Deployment Center. Deployment Center is in the portal. If you go to your app service and then you go to the management, all right, you can set up a deployment center, and then you can deploy code from Azure repos and from GitHub repos, so that every time you, for example, push to master or to main, then it's going to actually deploy to Azure. But you also have other solutions, like for example, deploying for OneDrive, from OneDrive or from Dropbox or even from FTP. All right, so this is also a place to go. I would say it's not quite continuous integration, continuous deployment yet, because you don't have really a lot of control over what's happening, but it is a possibility to do. Another thing, of course, is GitHub Actions. All right, you develop some actions in YAML. You also have a lot of templates, etc., and then they will run automatically when you do certain actions in GitHub. For example, pushing. And of course, Azure DevOps, which allows you to do full pipelines. You can create different releases of your application. You can also have something which is really, really convenient and practical, gated deployment, meaning that you can deploy to a slot, to your staging slot, and then after that you say, I want an email to be sent to a responsible person, and this responsible person can check it out and say, yes, I approve that this goes to production, or no, I want to reject that for some reasons. So Azure DevOps is really very versatile. We have boards, repos, we have artifacts, test plan, we have those pipelines. Pipelines are really cool. It's a way using a UI to define how you want to deploy your application, and you can deploy to really any solution, for example on-premise, but also any cloud or even Linux, Mac and Windows solutions. So that's really cool. You can have your stage environment releases, like I mentioned, deployment approvals, and we even have support for containers and Kubernetes. Now I'm not going to go deeper into DevOps in this session, because that's really the topic of other learning paths, but it's good to know that this exists. Let's talk about insights. Insights is about monitoring your application. And in the 5th session, we'll go really deep into Insight. We'll go deep into Azure Monitor. But in here, I already want to mention it so that you understand what it is for. If you have, for example, something where you have a web page and then you have web services, everything can be monitored. It's going to flow into a common pot. And then Insights is going to help you make sense of this data. For example, you can create alerts. If the website goes down, you can create an alert that you get through, push notifications, or that you get through SMS or email, etc. And we'll see a demo about that in the 5th session of this module. Power BI, so that you can create really powerful visualization of your usage, of your users. Where are they from? What are they doing? How much time are they spending on which page, etc. And then you can also export that if you have a third-party tool and then you want to visualize that in a third-party tool. So Application Insight, we'll see quickly in the demo how you can configure it. And then in the 5th session, like I say, we go much deeper. I mentioned Key Vault already in the introduction. It's important to understand that secrets always leak, right? So you want to have as few people responsible for secrets as possible, because as soon as you tell something to someone, the risk increases by a big factor. And we know that on GitHub, you have tons, for example, of SSH keys, which are on GitHub, and they shouldn't be there because it's a secret. You don't want your organization's secret to end up on a public GitHub repository, okay? That leads to being really not very happy, as you can see here. So this is why we have Key Vault as a service. So this is a service which runs next to your applications, all right, next to your data. It's going to help you manage secrets, for example, SQL connection strings, but also username and passwords, storage account keys, and even things like certificates, TLS, SSL, encryption keys, if you want to encrypt and decrypt your data. And this is a central location with a central management team, somebody that you really trust, and these secrets can be then used by multiple applications. So you can have, for example, the connection string in one location, but you can have 2, 3, 4 web applications using it. You can have a totally different person managing and monitoring the secret. So again, it's role-based access control, okay? And then you can have your developers accessing the secret from their application, but without ever seeing or managing the secret. So it's very, very convenient. And I want to show you in the demo how you can do that. So in this demo, we are going to configure the application for monitoring. Then we are going to move the connection string to Key Vault, and then I'll show you how you can scale up and scale out, as well as, of course, scale down and in again when you are done with the demand. So we are back in the Azure portal, okay? And again, pretty much everything I do in the Azure portal, you can always do with the Azure CLI, the command line interaction. We can do it in Bash, in PowerShell, with scripts if you have a preferred scripting environment. Some operations can even be done directly from Visual Studio Code or from Visual Studio, etc., etc. But here we are in the portal, and so I'm going to show you here a little bit more about this app service. But first of all, let's go into Application Insights, and as you can see, it's not turned on right now. All right, I didn't specify that it should be turned on by default, so we are going to turn it on right now, and from this moment we are going to start recording data. Now this is really very powerful, and notice that I didn't need to change anything in my code, all right, and I'm already going to start collecting data, things like, performance information, snapshot debugger. We'll talk more about that in the last session. It's about debugging in production, SQL commands. And if you are running your website with Node.js or with Java, for example, then we also have an SDK, and in .NET as well, you can use the SDK to add custom events to your application. For example, if you want to have some special information logged, etc., or maybe some performance information. All right, so we are creating the Application Insights instance. When it is done, we will go to check the data, but of course at this time we don't have any data. We literally just turned on the collection. But good to know that on Application Insight in the dashboard, you have some graphs. You can pin those graphs to your own Azure dashboard if you want to have a good view. All right, you can also see all kinds of things like performance, critical issues, etc. We'll talk more about that in the last session of this learning path. For now, I want to move the connection string. This is really bothering me that literally everyone who has access to the app service portal here can see the connection string. Not the users, of course, this is secure, but all the developers. And so I want to move that to Key Vault. And to do that, I'm going to start by giving an identity to my application. I'm going to basically allow the application to impersonate a user, to say, all right, I am a user with rights and I have access to certain services. As you see, this is very easy to do. It's actually managed by Azure Active Directory. So like this, now we have what we call a security principle that was created in Azure AD. And now we will go to the resource group and we're going to create the Key Vault. And then we will configure it so that my app service can have access to the Key Vault. So let's go to the marketplace. Just like before, I will have to enter some information for the Key Vault, things like, the subscription in which it's going to be billed, as a resource group, I'm going to use the same group, the name, of course. Then you want the region. For latency reasons, you want the Key Vault to be as close from your app service as possible. So I'm putting it in Western Europe. Pricing tier for us, standard is absolutely okay. If you choose premium, you have additional options. And the backup options are fine for me. So I'm going to review and create that. Creating the Key Vault creates a new service in Azure, but this service, the cool thing is that you can use it from multiple applications. And one thing which is nice is that you have an SDK. So if you want to do some fine-grained operations with code on your Key Vault, you can do that, but you can also access it in a way easier manner from App Service. I'm going to show you that in a second. So now I configure the access policy, meaning that I'm going to allow my app service to access the secret. And as you can see, you have a very fine-grained control. I'm just going to select here the get permission on secrets only. I need to select the principal. That's my app service. This is the GUID that I copied before. This is the app service that I want to give access to my secrets. All right. Let's go and add this access policy. This is done, and now I'm going to be able to, first of all, check that everything is fine. I have get access to secret. That's good. I can manage that here. The other thing I want to do is create a secret. So I'm going to create here a new one. I'm going to do a manual upload. Let's call it connection string. The value is the value of the connection strings that I'm taking from my app settings. And notice that one thing which is convenient, you can also set an activation date and an expiration date for your secrets. And you can even manually turn them off. For example, if you have some security concern, at any time you can go and turn the secret off. And then after that, deal with the security problem. All right, let's go and validate that. Seems to be running just fine. We have a version. Everything is version in Key Vault, so you always keep track of the changes. Let's go and identify the secret. So we are going to take a URI, which is uniquely identifying this secret. And now I can go back into my configuration of my app service. The app service should have access to the Key Vault now. We are going to verify that it works. Let's go to the configuration. This is the connection string that we want to change. We are going to remove this connection string in clear text. And now we use the syntax at microsoft.keyvault, and we paste the URI, which is a unique identifier for the secret that we want. So this is really convenient. You don't need to save, to modify your code. You don't need to use an SDK or anything. You can do that directly from here. After saving, if we go down, we see that the Key Vault reference has been parsed properly. There is a small green hack there which tells me that everything's good. If there was a syntax error or an access policy problem, then you would see a red cross, and you will see some details here in the setting details where it would tell you what is wrong. Most probably it's a problem with the managed identities that you didn't set properly, for example, but basically you will get some guidance here. All right, so now we have secured our configuration string, our connection string. That's really cool. I can go and refresh the website, and we will see that it is running just like before. And so basically we are ready to move to the next stage. And so for this next demo, what I would like to show you now is how you can do a scale up and a scale down. So this is, again, the web application that we have, all right? And this is the app service in the Azure portal. And here we have different things that we can do. If you want more power for your application because you see that it is struggling, or maybe you need more capacity or more bandwidth or more compute power, this is where you can do it. And we call this scale up. At any time, you can scale up and down. All right. So it's also important to know that you can scale down. For example, here, the app service plan I have cost around $150 per month, which is estimated. But if I see that I'm underutilizing that, maybe I want to go to the S1 instead, which is half price. Okay, so at any time you can do that. Now, scaling out is another matter altogether. It's about adding more servers, more instances of the same web server to your application and then replicating the application on it. You can do that in a manual manner. Here you can change the number of instances, but even better, you can do this automatically using a custom auto scale, which is based on metrics. So here is how you configure that. We are going to go and add a rule. All right. Here I said that I want a maximum of 2 servers, so you have control over your cost. Of course, you could say I want 10 servers maximum. And I'm going to observe the CPU percentage as a metric, but of course you can also observe other things, for example, data in, data out, to see if you have a lot of requests. Now for this demo, I'm going to do something you shouldn't do in production. I'm going to set the threshold to 30%. Normally, you want to set it at around 70%. You want to scale out only when it's really necessary. Here, it's really for the demo. I will say, if I go over 30% for more than 1 minute, I want to add a server. And notice I said minimum 1 server, maximum 2 servers only. All right. So let's go now to Application Insight, because I want to show you that you have a way to monitor that, to monitor the scaling. And this is using something that we call the live metrics. Live metrics is really a live view of what's going on in your application. You can put that on a dashboard, on a big screen in your project room, for example. So right now we see that we don't have any requests. I'm going to actually create a request on my application. Done. And if I go back, well, you see the request. It's right here. Okay. And I had just 1 request, a request rate of 1 per second. Now I'm going to turn on a tool which is simulating a lot of requests. You see that the tool, it's called Artillery. It's actually sending requests at a rate of about 200 per second or more, which means that my CPU is going consistently over 50%. And as you can see, the scale-up rule worked. Now I have 2 servers. Remember that I said I want a maximum of 2 servers. That's why I don't have more than those. But basically, we see that the rule worked. And now I know that I can serve the demand, and I won't have a denial of service at some point or whatever. All right, so this is the end already of this session, and I hope that you have learned a lot. What did we see in this session? First of all, we have seen how to move the application to app service using the app service migration assistant. All right, we did the assessment in the first session. Now we have actually moved the code and everything, and then we have configured the application telemetry, and of course we have turned on Application Insight, which is now collecting data. And later in the 5th session, we will see how we can make sense of this data and how you can really use Insight to refine the way that your application works. We have also added Key Vault as an additional service to our application. And then we moved one very important secret, the connection string, to Key Vault. Like this, we have role-based access control. It means that the developers don't see the connection string anymore. There is no risk that it gets mangled. But also, very importantly, if you need to modify the connection string, like we will see in the next demo, then basically you modify it once into Key Vault and then it's done. And then after that, we talked about scaling up and scaling out. We understood the difference between both, all right? Scaling up being choosing a more powerful app service plan, scaling down a less powerful service plan, so you save money. Scaling out, meaning you're going to have copies of your web server, and we saw how to do that in an automated manner. And of course, at any time, it's also going to scale in if the demand disappears, so you save money. Call to action, it's always time to learning. You should always keep learning. Go to aka.ms/mod20 and you will have links to tutorials, samples, Microsoft Learn module, and more. Hopefully this session was useful for you. This was the second session of this learning path. So this was module 2 of this learning path. In here we have seen the actual migration of the web application to app services. And in the next module we are going to talk about the data, because if you remember, now we have a hybrid solution with data on-premise, the web application in Azure. We are going to change that in the next module. So let's start with a 10 minutes break, and I'll see you after the break for module 3. Learning path. In here we are going to talk about data. This is where we take the data which is right now still on-premise in an old SQL server. We are going to move it to the cloud in a brand new Azure SQL database. We'll also talk about Azure storage and the different data solutions that we have on Azure. So let's get started with module 3. So this session is titled Moving Application Data to the Cloud, and you may remember that in the first session we have assessed the database migration. We have seen that we had a couple of services that were not supported on Azure SQL database, but we decided to move on with the migration anyway because we can live with that. And if you cannot live with that, on the other hand, you have always an alternative, which is Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, so you will see what are the particularities, the specificities of this solution. So we already saw this slide, but I just want to go through one thing quickly here. Specifically for data, one important migration driver can be if you have an acquisition in mind, like if you have been acquired or you have acquired a firm, because very often firms use different data systems. Like for example, they could be using MySQL and you are using PostgreSQL. They might be using NoSQL with Cosmos DB or even with MongoDB, and you are using SQL database with SQL Server, for example. And so on Azure, you have the possibility to integrate those solutions easily because we have those as a service. You can run them as a service, and then you can easily connect them, for example, with some express route or even with some software, and maybe building a quick application, a quick function, and things like that. So again, right, many migration drivers, many reasons why you want to drive and to go to the cloud. But if you want to go back more in detail, go back to the first session where I explained all that. The migration journey, all right, we have seen that we have those 4 different stages, and the assessment was inside the first session. The last session, just before this one, we have done the migration of the web application to app service, and now in here we are going to go to migrating the data itself, and we'll also talk about optimizing the data and seeing how you can optimize your cost, your performance, your security. All right, so moving on to this session. This session, we are going to, first of all, recap a little bit what Azure Migrate can bring you, and then we are going to meet a few tools that can help you with the migration, because we have multiple tools that can help you with the migration. And then we'll talk about data solutions on Azure. We have a lot of different ways to host data, be it relational data, non-relational data, or structured, semi-structured, these kind of things. Then we'll talk about migrating the SQL database itself. This icon here is the one of the database migration service. This is a new tool that I will introduce, and then we'll do the migration itself in the demo. And then we'll talk about optimizing the services, not just for cost, but also for performance and security. And then we'll talk about Azure storage, because data comes in multiple forms, multiple shapes. Maybe you have relational, non-relational, but maybe you also have, amorphous data which doesn't have a specific shape, unstructured data. And that can be, for example, images, videos, it could be PDF files. The PDF file per se has a structure. When you open it, you see text. But in terms of the binary files that is hosting it, it doesn't have a relation, it doesn't have a structure. And we have solutions for you to host that, for example, in Azure Storage. So let's talk about the migration tools, and I told you already that we are going to work here mostly with the database migration service, which is a very managed and very versatile tool, but we also have other tools, and so I wanted quickly to mention to you where you can get started. So one good place to get started is on the web, and here we have the Azure Database Migration Guide. This is a place where you can select different sources and different targets, and you see that we even support Access, for example, and please don't chuckle, because I often get this question in conferences. People ask me, well, I do have an Access database, I've been using Access for many years, I would like to move that to Azure, is there a way? And definitely we have migration solutions here. So here you can go and say, all right, I want to get started from DB2, from Oracle, from Cassandra, etc., etc. And then we will show you the different targets that you have, that you can use, and the different tools that can help you to do that. Another tool specifically for SQL Server as a target, it's the SQL Server Migration Assistant. And here again, you can migrate from Access, from DB2, from MySQL, from SAP to SQL Server on-premise, but also to Azure SQL Database single instance. And so that can be a very, very interesting scenario if you have some migration that you want to do pretty quick. However, I would say we these days recommend to use the Database Migration Service whenever possible, because it is really a managed migration tools, and even for very large solutions, very large workloads, then you can use that, and then that's going to work just fine. So before we do the migration itself, I would like to talk about different data solutions on Azure, because you need a target for your data. You need to know what exists so that you can even host your data. And the first one I want to mention is Azure Cosmos DB. This is really like the crown of the jewel, or the jewel of the crown rather, that you can use in Azure. It's a NoSQL database. It's very, very powerful. In fact, a lot of Microsoft and a lot of Azure run on Cosmos DB, so we are definitely using it for us as well. It is a globally distributed database, and I know you're going to tell me, well, Azure SQL database is also globally distributed in the sense that I can select a secondary database, and that's going to be used for backup. And you can even read with certain data plans, you can even read from this secondary database, and this is true. But Azure Cosmos DB was thought really from the ground up as a globally distributed database. And for example, you have the possibility not just to read from different locations, but even to write to different locations. And then after that, you will have replication happening, and you have different consistency models that you can choose from. For example, you could say, I don't know, I want to write the data and come back to my application as fast as possible, but then I know that I will need a little bit of time for the data to be replicated worldwide. Or you can say, no, I want when my application, when the request comes back to my application, I want to know that the data has been already replicated. So you have those 5 different models that you can choose from. Of course, you have the possibility to scale out and scale in easily. You can configure that very easily. We guarantee a few things. This is what SLA means, service level agreement. We have things like low latency, below 10 milliseconds for read and for write, so it is very low. We have things like high availability, and in fact, I want to say very high availability, 99.999%. But for the developer, what's also interesting is that you can host your data in multiple shapes. For example, key value, or column family, or document DB, or graph. And we have also different APIs allowing you to access this data, meaning that if you have an existing application, for example with MongoDB, you can migrate your data to Cosmos DB with a Mongo API, and then you barely need to change your application, you just need to change the connection string. Similarly with Gremlin, Cassandra, and you can even access the data, the document DB, with SQL commands, which for a NoSQL database is kind of funny, but it really does work, and so that gives you really a great flexibility. Now, another thing I want to mention is the Azure database for open source database engine. Now, those open source database engines are very, very popular, especially PostgreSQL. But think about MySQL. This is a M in the LAMP stack, okay, the Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. So this is a very, very popular solution. We also have MariaDB, which is a community fork of MySQL with, additional features and community driven. Those open source databases are very efficient. They are very performant. They are also quite cheap to run. And the cool thing is that if you migrate those to Azure, then you get all the benefits of Azure, things like automated backups, the patching of the database engine so that you don't have to worry about it yourself, monitoring because it's going to participate in the global monitoring solutions with Azure Monitor, security. All right. So you really have a lot of advantages in doing that. It's pretty much the best of both worlds if you want. You have your open source database, but you also have the versatility and the flexibility and the power of Azure. Now, Azure SQL Database, this is what we are going to be migrating in this particular session. A few takeaways around that. Azure SQL Database is a fully managed platform as a service. So it is a platform-oriented alternative to running SQL Server in a VM. All right, you have a lot of advantages around that. We guarantee 99.99% availability, so it has a high availability. And then it is based on SQL Server technology, which means that if you have a tool that you know and love, for example, SQL Server Management Studio, SQL Command, the Azure Data Studio, or even Visual Studio for that matter, you can access Azure SQL Database over some well-known APIs and well-known SDKs. So it is quite consistent. Now it comes originally by default in two different versions, single database, which means that you have one server with multiple databases and each database has a set of resources that it's going to use. Or you can also select, you can add your database to what we call an elastic pool. Elastic pool means that the resources are going to be shared. And for example, let's imagine that you have a scenario where you have two databases, one with a product description for your website and one which is used for reporting. Typically, during the day, you're going to need a lot of power for the product description and for this database, which is driving your e-commerce website. But then in the night, maybe you want to run some analytics on your reports, and maybe you want to give more power to this other database, a reporting database. This is the kind of scenario that you can use. And I want also to mention that the database can be taken in and out of an elastic pool at any time, so you have also flexibility here. Of course, we have full monitoring and alerting capacity. We can let you know when there is a problem with your database, either from a security standpoint, from a performance standpoint, or even from an availability standpoint, so that you always know what's happening. Now, I mentioned that Azure SQL Database single instance is based on SQL Server. It's true. One thing which is nice with it is that it is very cost-effective to run, but on the other hand, we don't have 100% capacity with SQL Server. So if you are using certain options of SQL Server, I don't know, for example, things like compiled CLR or cross-database joins, which are not currently supported on Azure SQL Database, then Azure SQL Database Managed Instance might be a good solution for you. And maybe you remember when we did the assessment in the first session, I selected Azure SQL Database single instance as a target because I know it's cost effective, but I told you that if the two features that were deemed incompatible were causing issues, then maybe I could upgrade to an Azure SQL Database Managed Instance instead. So what is Azure SQL Database Managed Instance? It's a new flavor of SQL Database if you want, running on Azure. It is also a fully managed service. It's a platform as a service, so it's not SQL Server on a VM, okay? It's really something that is running as platform as a service. It has the same infrastructure as SQL Database, so you can use the same tools. But in addition, you have this increased compatibility, almost 100% compatibility with SQL Server running on-premise. So essentially, you could say it's SQL Server in the cloud, all right? Now, in addition to the added compatibility, you also have full isolation and security. So it is clearly an enterprise-grade solution where you have a private virtual network, you have private IP addresses, no public IP addresses. You can connect to it using ExpressRoute or VPN. And so, for example, you can have a scenario where you have a VNet, you have your database on it, it's fully private, nobody can access the data except possibly an application service, a web application, for example, which then has port 80 exposed, and every access to the database runs through the application so that you have additional control over what's going on. So that's quite a nice thing. Now, of course, with all those features, Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, it's an enterprise grade solution. It is more expensive than Azure SQL Database single instance. The cost, however, is transparent. It's easy to see if you want to add more features, more CPUs, etc., how much it's going to cost, and it is competitive as well. All right, so let's talk about the demo. I'm going to show you how we are going to create the Azure SQL database first, how we can configure it, and then later we'll do the migration itself. So I'm going to go into the Azure portal, and as always, everything I do in the Azure portal can be done also, for example, with Cloud Shell, with command line interaction, etc. Let's go into the marketplace. Here you see that in the popular section, we have SQL database. We have also some demos, some docs, some tutorials, some quick starts. So basically, we really take you by the hand and we teach you how to do this. Let's go and select SQL Manage Instance because I want to show you how you can create one if you need one at some point. So as you can see, this is a resource like any other in Azure, all right? You're going to have a few things to configure. Note that it's not running in every region at the moment, so you need to make sure that you select a region in which this database, this service is actually available. For example, Western Europe, Western US, Eastern US, Northern Europe, etc., or of course in Southeast Asia as well. So that's good to know that you need to be careful about that. Here, if I go and select, for example, Western Europe, you see that I have it. You have, of course, different configurations that you can use. For now, I'm not going to need that. I'm going to go to a single instance SQL database. And here I have the subscription and the resource group just like before. I'm going to enter a database name for that. Now, of course, the database name needs to follow certain rules. You're going to be checked as you go, so it's going to be validated, all right? And then I'm going to select a server. At the moment, I don't have a SQL server, so I'm going to create a new one. And then later, remember that you could have multiple databases per server. The name needs to be unique, all right? So again, it is validated as you type. I'm going to add my initials in front. And then I'm going to enter a SQL Server admin login with username and password, all right? And eventually, I'm going to select the region for the server because, again, you have a choice here, and I'm going to put it in Western Europe so that it is close from my application service that I migrated in the previous session. Here, I could select to use Elastic Pool if I wanted to. But here I can also scale up and scale down. And the good thing to know is that you can at any time scale up and scale down. Notice that you also have a hyperscale solution. If you have some really high volumes of data, you can use that. Now, once you migrate into hyperscale, you cannot migrate out of it. But you see that here I have a very cost-effective solution where I'm going to pay an estimated $15 per month. So for this small application, it's quite attractive. The networking, just want to show you that I'm going to configure no access at all for the moment. We'll talk about the firewall a little bit later. And here you have advanced data security that you can configure. We'll do that later. And I'll explain to you more about advanced data security just a little bit later. So here the deployment is in progress. Like always on Azure, it's taking a few minutes. Here we go a little bit faster. When the resource is available, we can go into the dashboard, all right? And as you can see, this is a database dashboard, not the server dashboard. This is really the database here. I have different connection strings, all right? ADO.NET, JDBC, ODBC, PHP, Go, so you have different ways to access it. And now let me show you the advanced data security that we talked about. Now this is an additional cost of $15 per server per month. All right, this is per server, not per database. And it's really good because for $15 you're going to have peace of mind. We are going to run some assessments on a regular basis, all right? And it's going to show you vulnerabilities. For example, here, notice that I have one high-risk vulnerability. Immediately after creating the database, it says you should enable audit at the server level, which is probably a good advice. Now, we're also going to run scans on your data. For example, if you have things like SQL injection or if you have unusual login activity, we are going to notify you. So that's really good to know. Let's go to the server now. Okay, this is a server which is hosting the database. At the moment, I just have one database here. And here I have the possibility to go and configure the firewall because right now it's totally blocked. Nobody can access this server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow other Azure services and resources to access this server, meaning that if it's running on Azure on the same virtual network, it will have access to the server, which is the case of my web application. So that's good to know. All right, we can go back to the database. Let's go up. And now I want to show you that you can see the data directly in your web browser. You can, of course, use another tool like SQL Server Management Studio if you prefer. But one thing is that here I'm going to be denied access as expected because my client, which is really my laptop, that's the IP address of my laptop, doesn't go through the firewall. So let's go and add the client IP to the firewall rules. Okay, this is my current laptop IP. I'm going to save that. And then once this is saved, we are going to go back to the query editor, and now we can log in. Of course, at this time, the database is empty. There are no tables because we didn't migrate yet. But basically, at this point, we are ready for the migration. So let's talk about the migration itself, and let's talk about the Azure Database Migration Service. Now, this is a very powerful tool, very nice to use as well, very easy to use and convenient. And you're going to be able to migrate from different sources to different targets. For example, you see that we support SQL Server as a source running inside your premise or inside AWS. And then for the target, for SQL Server on-premise, we have Azure SQL DB, Azure SQL DB Managed Instance, or even Azure SQL running in a virtual machine, all right? For Oracle, we support a migration path to Azure Database for PostgreSQL. DB2 into SQL DB. MongoDB, that's a NoSQL solution. You can run it into Azure Cosmos DB with Mongo API, for example. And like this, you have a migration path, and then you can just switch a connection string. You don't need to modify your application. And even those open source databases, MySQL running in AWS, PostgreSQL running in AWS, and then we have after that the target for the corresponding Azure database, for example, MySQL or PostgreSQL. All right, so the database migration service is what we are going to use in the demo to do the migration. So let's go back to our portal, all right? And in this portal, we are going to create a new resource, and this is going to be the Database Migration Service, DMS for short. Let's go and create it. As always, you have some tutorials and everything here. Now you can select the name of the migration service, and you can select the configuration. We are going to take a premium configuration because it's going faster, and it doesn't cost anything for 6 months, so it's really good. All right. We are going to enter a name for the DMS, a region, and here I'm not going to do that because creating the DMS takes a certain number of minutes, and I already created one, so I'm going to go back into my resource group. You see the one I created is right here. It is empty, okay? I didn't start to do any migration at this point, so we are going to start by creating a new migration project. What is a project? Is essentially a source to target pair, and then you can have multiple activities on this project. So let's give it a name, rewards MIG, all right? I'm going to select the source server type, and so again, we have here all the sources and then later all the targets that you can select. For example, if I select MongoDB, I can choose Cosmos DB with MongoDB API as a target. If I select something like, SQL Server running on AWS, you have a path. Oracle, we have a path. And you also have those open source databases, PostgreSQL, MySQL. And so here, if I select, for example, PostgreSQL, I can migrate to Azure Database for PostgreSQL as a choice. So we have quite a lot of different choices, but here we want really to migrate a SQL Server. And so let's go and select SQL Server as a source. And then for the target, here I would have Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, or SQL Database running on a virtual machine in Azure. So those are the different migration paths that we have. Now we are going to select the type of activity. And here, the SQL migration is a two-step migration where we are going to start by migrating the schema first. So we are just going to migrate the table definition, all right? So now I have my project ready, and then I'm going to create a new activity. And this activity, of course, I need to configure it. So I need to say, all right, what is the source of the data? So let's enter the name of the virtual machine where it's running right now. Then I'm going to select SQL authentication, username, and password. All right. And then when this is done, the DMS is going to try to connect to the source database. And if he can do that, we are going to select the target. So this is the target. I have the server name right here in the dashboard. Let's go and copy it. All right. And then after that, I'm also going to enter here the authentication. Username is Tailwind, password is secret, of course. Here we go. Then again, the DMS is going to try to connect to the target. And when this is done, we are going to say which database we want to migrate. Okay. And then we create the activity. So this activity is about migrating the schema only. So we call it mix schema, for example. I'm going to run the migration. This is a very small database. You remember it has just like two tables, sorry. So this is really small. So it's going to take a short time. But if you have a big database, it's just going to take longer, but everything is going to run in exactly the same manner. So we can just refresh quickly. We see that it is completed now. Perfect. Let's go back into the DMS, and I'm going inside the same project to create a new activity. Now here we have the choice between online data migration and offline data migration. So this is important to understand what is the difference. Now, online data migration is great to avoid any downtime into your application. And so here is the explanation. If you have a web application, it's going to write to the source SQL server. Then you want to do the migration. What you do is you switch off the web application for the moment, and then you do the migration, switch the connection string. But during the downtime, you have lost some customers because they went to the competition and they probably never come back because your website was down. So with the online migration, what's going to happen is that you don't need the downtime. You're going to do the migration to the target Azure SQL database, all right? During this time or after this time, if users are continuing to write to the old source, this is going to be updating the target. And like this, when you're ready, when you have run all your tests, you can switch the connection string, and then only you can discard the old source SQL server because you don't need it anymore. Now here, for the demo, I'm using a offline migration because it goes faster, but remember that you have the possibility to do an online migration as well. All right, so now we are logged into the source and the target. We have the database selected. We could set the source database to read-only if we wanted to. All right, I'm going to select the tables. Tables have been migrated, so this is good. And now I can go. One thing I want to note at this point is that you have the possibility to scale up to an additional, to a more powerful SQL server. And that's really nice on Azure that you can do that. And then after the migration, you can scale back down to save money. But during the migration like this, you have more DTU or you have more power so that the migration runs faster. So it's good to know that you can do that. Now we are ready to run the migration, all right? Just like before, it's going to take a very short time here because this is a very small database. But if you have a large database, you can also migrate it in exactly the same manner. The only difference is really that it's just going to take longer. All right. Now we have migrated the data. So we can go and check if everything seems to have been migrated okay. All right. Let's go to the connection string. We are going to copy that. And then we will go back to the application. But remember, the connection string in the previous session, we didn't save it in the web application. We saved it in Key Vault because we do things in a very managed manner, in a very nice manner. So we have this connection string in Key Vault. And in Key Vault, I cannot simply go and change the connection string. This is the old version of the connection string. What I can do, however, is create a new version of the connection string. So let's go because everything is audited, everything is kept. So I'm going to go here. This is a name. This is a new value. All right, let's paste what we just copied. Now in this connection string, the password is actually not set yet. So I'm going to quickly open here or rather visualize the connection string. We are going to find the password and we are going to replace it with the correct password. By the way, this database doesn't exist anymore, so don't even try to connect to it. All right, now we have a new identifier for the version of the connection string, so I'm going to take it. We can go back to our web application, which is here. And then in the configuration, if you remember, we had this syntax at microsoft.keyvault. And so this allows me to access the Key Vault value without having to use an SDK. So this is here the old value. I'm going to use the new identifiers that I just copied. And here is the famous syntax at Microsoft.keyvault, and then the secret URI, which means that the developers don't see the connection strings. They don't need to. We have a trusted team with role-based access control who can manage those secrets. All right, so now we are updating the configuration. And if you go here and resubmit the form, for example, we see that everything works the same way as before, which means that we have performed the migration. The data has been migrated. We can totally go and switch off the old database because we don't need it anymore. Let's quickly check in the query editor. We see our tables. We can see here all the different columns. And if I run a quick query, for example, select star from customers, and then run this, we see it's a little bit small here on the screen, but we see that the data has been obtained. So basically, everything runs fine. And now we are fully running on Azure, which means that we are ready to optimize the services. And that will be the next step in this presentation. So now that our application has been ported to the cloud, it's a good time to optimize the service. And really, I want you to think when the application is running great, when the customers are happy, this is a great time for you to pause and see how you can make it even better, how you can optimize security, of course, but also performance. And of course, at the end, also optimize your cost, because this is what you want. You want to serve your customers with excellence, but you also want to pay less for it, obviously, right? So optimizing the services, there are different things that you can do. Let's start with security. That's really the first in line. And again, like I mentioned in the first session, this is a business as usual activity. You should always be optimizing your security. The very first thing you should do is at the database level and at the server level, you should have firewall rules. And if you remember the demo, we closed everything at first. Nobody had access to this database. And then after that, we opened for other Azure services. For example, the app service, which is going to access the data. And then we also added one IP address for my own client for my laptop, so that I could access it using the query editor or using, of course, other tools such as SQL Server Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, etc. So firewalls, very important. If you feel that the firewall at the database and at the server level are not enough, you can also secure your virtual network. For example, with network security groups, with other firewalls, and so you can have really a layered approach to security. Azure Active Directory, super important. Okay, right now we are using a SQL login with username and password, but why not use Azure Active Directory instead? And why not give an identity to your applications and allow them to access other services? Or maybe you also want to have role-based access control for access to the management of your database. So this is really also a good place to go. And finally, advanced data security. I showed you quickly how you can configure it. It's going to run all the time. It's going to check your data. It's going to warn you if something is bad, and it's going to give you peace of mind. Performance of your queries, all right? This is something that you can totally optimize using our tools. And of course, queries are what takes a long time in your data, okay? In the handling of your data. The application is going to access the data. And here you have access, you have an insight into DTU consumption. This is important because at the end, this is what you're going to pay, all right? But also things like CPU usage, the duration of a query, and how many times a query is executed. And for example, you can say, all right, I want to optimize the queries that last the longer, or I want to optimize the queries that are called the most often, all right? Something like that. You can really totally drill into the details, get more information about what's taking a long time. And we're also going to give you some recommendations on how you can actually accelerate those queries, how you can make them run faster. And if you choose to do so, we can even do some of the work automatically for you. So this is the address where you can get more information about the SQL Query Performance Analyzer. And really, I recommend that you look into it because it's a great way to make your customers happy. Also, some information about SQL tuning your database, tuning your SQL Server for more performance. As for cost, of course, this is super interesting for you because this is what you're going to do to pay less. And here we have the Azure Cost Management Center. Now, this is going to give you always a breakdown of what your spending is at the moment and also an estimation of your spending for the coming few days until the end of the month. So it's a good place to spend some time. We are also going to give you some recommendation on how you can optimize your spendings into the cloud. And by the way, I'm not sure if you know already, but if you don't know about it, if you have SQL Server licenses for your on-premise servers, you can actually leverage those in the cloud. This is what we call the Azure Hybrid benefit. And you also have Azure Reserved instances, which are going to give you more flexibility on how you utilize your resources, and also which are going to save you quite a lot of money. So definitely interesting to check. This is going, of course, to bring more value to your application on the long term. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is the type of storage, all right? Because you have different type of storage, you have different data solutions on Azure. So we talked already about structured data, relational data, for example, the product description, all right? You have different tables and those tables have relations, and this is great for SQL. But maybe you have what I would call some semi-structured data. And for example, think about the shopping cart. Shopping carts are very simple to use. All right, you have one object where you have all the data, and then you want to pretty much serialize this object to storage, and you want this to go as fast as possible with as much security as possible, and possibly even be replicated worldwide. Like this, you will have a faster write access to the shopping cart. So this is a good use case for Cosmos DB. But you also have another type of data, and this is the unstructured data, okay, the blobs, what we call blobs, binary large objects. And here that could be pictures, videos, PDF, any type of binary files really. And for this we also have solutions, and this is Azure Storage. So let's go into Azure Storage services. We have quite a lot of services. Some of them I would say are closer to infrastructure as a service, things like disks, all right? Your virtual machines need disks, and here we have the possibility to manage them. You have HDDs, SSDs, etc. But you also have files, and files can be interesting for a legacy scenario. Let's imagine that you have a file share on your server and your users are, saving files to it. You can easily migrate that to the cloud to a file service in Azure Storage. And then after that, you also have access via SMB, even encrypted SMB, so the SMB protocol, which is used by Windows Explorer or by other solutions on other platforms. And like this, you can access very easily your cloud file share from Windows Explorer on your local machine, and then you have basically lifted and shifted your application. Now, on the platform as a service side, it is still Azure Storage, still the same service. You have blobs, and we'll come back to blobs because this is where we are going to spend a little bit more time. You also have tables and queues. Tables are non-relational tables. It's a very simple key value way of storing things. You can have massive data into there, so it's quite interesting. You also have dynamic scaling. It can scale up to petabytes of data. Queues are more for messaging. It's like a first in, first out messaging system, quite interesting. So let's talk about blobs. Blobs are binary large objects. You can access all the Azure Storage services via REST, all right? So we have APIs for that. We also have SDKs for different languages, .NET of course, but also Java, JavaScript, etc. And everything is built on a unified storage system. So you have resiliency, you have encryption at rest, all right? You have also the replication, which is strongly consistent. This is all working in the same manner. Load balancing, fault tolerance, etc. Blobs, we have different tiers. That's quite interesting. You can have a hot tier, like a hot container, which is reacting very fast with minimal latency. But you can also have a cool tier. And so typically what we observe is that files are accessed a lot in the first few days that they are stored. But then after that, the usage tends to go down. And maybe that's a good time where you want to move this data to a cool storage tier because it's going to be a lot less expensive. Now you will have a little bit more latency, but you will also save a lot of money. So the hot tier for the beginning, after that the cool tier. And if you do backups, all right, those are large data files that you access. Ideally, you never want to access them. Sometimes you need to access them. Then you can copy that to an archive tier. An archive tier is very, very cheap. Of course, the latency there is going to be way bigger, all right? It can take really a long time to restore those files, so you need to be a little bit careful with that, but it is a good place to store data that you want to keep for a very long time. So we'll spend a little bit more time in the blob service here, and let's see a demo on how you can migrate big files to Azure Storage. And in that case, the files that we are going to migrate are not really huge. They are image data that we have in our web application. So this is the web application here, and this one is actually another web application. It is the Tailwind Traders e-commerce website. This is a very, very critical part of our infrastructure, and this is a website here that you can see. And if we go down to the categories, you see that we have a lot of images, and right now those images are actually stored inside the web server itself. This is how we used to do things back then, but it's not great because it means they are probably to end up into source control. And here you see, for example, this image comes from /product detail, which is a folder inside the web server. So they probably go into source control. It's not great. Now here, this application is quite good because we have actually a setting where we can specify where the images come from. You see that they come from /product detail in this case. So what we are going to do now is take those images and we are going to move them into Azure Storage, because like this we'll have a CDN, all right, Content Delivery Network. By the way, if we use a console, I don't know if you know that, but there is also a console in App Service in the portal directly, so we can navigate to the folder and see all the files. This is quite convenient directly in the web browser. So let's go into the Azure Storage Explorer. You can use different tools to do that, also directly in the portal if you want. I'm going to create a new blob container. And then one thing you shouldn't forget is set the public access level. So now I'm going to say if I have a URL for a blob, I can access it in an anonymous manner. But I need the URL for the blob. So this is what we are going to be constructing in the application. Those are the images of the website. I'm just going to upload them using the Azure Storage Explorer. Again, I have multiple tools to do that. I could use also the portal if I want, or there is also AZ Copy. And now I'm copying the unique URL for one of those blobs, because each one of those blobs has a unique URL. And now if I go into the configuration, into the product images URL setting, I can replace this local folder with the URL of the container where those blobs are located. All right, I can save that. The application is going to restart. It is actually going to be seamless, so that's cool. After a short wait, we can go back to the website, refresh, and now we are going to see that the image is still there. It is running fine. But this time, if I select it, we see that it is coming from my Azure Blob Storage. And like this, I can go back to my web server. I can delete those images. I can copy also other big files, for example, videos, etc., etc. And I optimize my cost because Azure Storage is much less expensive than the service plan for sure. And maybe I can even downgrade to a smaller service plan if I want to. So it's good to know that you can do that. So let's review what we learned in this session. We saw quite a few components. First of all, we of course talked about Azure Migrate again, because this is really the hub where we are spending most time, all right? We saw also other tools for the migration. We talked about data solutions, all right? NoSQL, SQL, open source databases running on Azure Database. Then we did the migration using the database migration service, which is our managed migration tool. Then we optimized. First of all, we talked about optimizing the security, but we also talked about costs and about performance. And then I showed you how you can take different types of data, such as unstructured data, and move it to Azure Storage instead, so that you have really a complete overview of the data solutions. So hopefully this session was useful for you. This is now where you can learn more, because you should always keep learning. aka.ms/mod30, and in there you will find links to tutorials, samples, module on Microsoft Learn, because Microsoft Learn is really where you can continue learning. So hopefully this was a helpful session for you. So that was module 3 of this learning path. In here, we talked about data, everything data. We took a demo of taking the on-premise SQL Server data, moving it to the cloud into a brand new Azure SQL database. We also talked about other data solutions, relational data, of course, but also non-relational data with NoSQL, unstructured data with Azure Storage. Thank you so much for your attendance so far. This was the end of part 1 of this course. In the part 2, we are going to continue talking about modernizing .NET applications. So we will see you next time. Might wonder what is really a custom domain name, and so let's recap a little bit. So when you create an app service on Azure, like we did before, we saw that we have something like, for example, myappservice.azurewebsites.net, and that is the same also for Azure Functions. Now, if you have other services, other Azure services, for example, storage accounts, etc., then maybe you will have something different. But basically, this is not an address that you control. It's just assigned to you. Maybe you control only the first part, which is in that case my app service. And as a custom domain, it could be pretty much anything you want as long as it is available, of course. For example, in that case, we are going to use www.tailwindtraders.xyz. And so in this session, we are going to talk about basics of domain name services. Now, this is some generic information that is not just valid for Azure, but which is going to be valid for pretty much any system that you're going to work on. And then after that, we will concentrate on Azure with custom domains in Azure services. And those will be lots of demo. We are going to see how to set custom domain for app services, websites, but also for function application, for storage accounts. And then once you have the custom domain, a good idea is to secure it. And this is the HTTPS that you sometimes see. The S stands for secure. And this is done with something which is called TLS security certificate. And so we'll see how you can acquire one, how you can use one for those different services. Finally, we will do some load balancing because on Azure, we saw that you have different ways to scale up and down or to scale out and in, but you may also want to have multiple servers, for example, on different locations which are balancing the load, which are using the load. And that can be done with a service on Azure called the Azure Traffic Manager. It's not the only way that you can actually do a load balancing in Azure. We also have something called Front Door, and there are other options also, and so we will do a quick review about that at the end. So a lot of demos in this application. But first, let's talk about DNS and domain name servers or domain name services. And those have different parts. And maybe some of those abbreviations, you're going to have seen them already. For example, TLD, top level domain. Now, there are literally hundreds of those, okay? It can be .com, .org, .net. I remember in the early days of internet, you really had only a few TLDs, like .com, .org, .net, and that was pretty much it. There was edu, also edu for education. And nowadays, you have really 100 more. For example, XYZ is a valid top-level domain, or .info, or .media, etc., really a lot. And don't forget that you also have top-level domains for countries, all right? For example, .ch, I'm located in Switzerland, and so that would be .ch, which is the abbreviation for Switzerland, or .fr, .it, etc., etc. So that's quite interesting, and this is something that you don't control yourself. You go to a registrar, and then you say, all right, I want to buy a custom domain which ends in .com, so the top-level domain is .com. And then after that, if we dive a little bit deeper, we have what is called an A record. A stands for apex. Apex, the definition of apex means the top part of something, the highest part of something. And sometimes we refer to those as root domain or maybe a naked domain because there is no www in front or no mail in front or no whatever. Okay, so it's just basically, for example, in that case, tailwindtraders.xyz. And so this is going to be defined into the DNS system by assigning an IP address to that. So the traffic is going to be redirected to an IP address. And then after that, if you go again one lower, you have the CNAME record. CNAME stands for canonical name record. And that can be sometimes called a subdomain, for example, www or api.tailwindtraders.xyz. Or it can even be multi-level, for example, us.north.api.tailwindtraders.xyz. Now, what is going to happen here with the CNAME record is a redirection. So basically, the traffic which comes inside to www.tailwindtraders.xyz is going to be redirected to another DNS entry. In that case, for example, tailwindtraders.azurewebsites.net. So if we recap a little bit what is in a URL, this is a unique resource locator, and the idea here is that really every resource on the web has a unique address. All right, this is a uniform resource locator. And for example, this is an example here. And if we examine what we have here, we start with the protocol. The protocol in that case is HTTPS, so it tells you that it's a web address. It's a secure web address, but it could also be something else. Okay, a URL is not just for the web. For example, it could be mail to. It could be, back then in my days, we had NNTP, the news transfer protocol. Or maybe you have protocol, like custom protocols for Teams calls, for example, for Microsoft, etc., etc. And then after that, you have the .com, which is a top-level domain. We talked about that. We have the Apex, all right? And then we have the CNAME, which is in that case www, but it could be literally anything you want. And then after that, in order to uniquely identify a resource on the web server, then you have a path. And the path can be something.html. It can be, in that case, page name, $1 equals 2, etc. So it's always different. And for each URL, you are going to expect a different response. And here, in that case, we also have a query string. Now, in certain URLs, you will also see additional parts, for example, a hashtag which is going to lead to a target on the page, etc. But really what we have here is what defines a unique resource locator from a server-side perspective, if you want. And this is where the domain name services are going to act on those parts, the CNAME, the Apex, and the TLD. So of course, in order to set up a DNS, you need to verify that you own the domain. And why is it important? Well, because you want to prove that you actually own this address, because otherwise I could go and I could say, hey, I own Microsoft.com, please send me all the address, all the traffic that is going to Microsoft.com. And of course, you don't want that. So there are a few ways that you can do that, but really it's important to know that you cannot use a domain unless you verify it. And there are different verification methods. Here on Azure, we will see a validation using a TXT record, a text record. We will talk about that in a moment. But there are also other validation methods, which depends a little bit on the provider that you are using. So without further ado, we are going to dive into a demo. And here we are going to set a custom domain on an Azure app service. So let's go into the dashboard. Here, as you can see, we have different components that we'll use for the demos in this session. For example, here we have an app service which is titled www-tailwindtraders.com, and we will use our custom domain www.tailwindtraders.xyz to point to this web application. We will also do the same with subdomains for functions and also for a storage account where the process is a little bit different, as you can see later. Then we have also two app services running in Central US and in Europe, and we will do some load balancing between those two. And all this is possible thanks to DNS. So this is where we are going to set up the DNS in this particular demo. So let's go into the DNS portal. And here we see that this DNS is set up for tailwindtraders.xyz. So first we are going to see that we already told our registrar, this is where we bought the domain name, that it has to point back to Azure to those 4 different values. We see that we have ns1, 2, 3, and 4 -05.azure-dns.com. So basically this is a redirection that the registrar is going to do for us and point all the traffic back to Azure. And in fact, if we go into a terminal and we do a host command, we see that for the public is already informed that this particular domain is pointing back to Azure. However, we haven't defined anything yet. And so if we go into a portal, into a website, and we try to open www.tailwindtraders.xyz, then this is going to fail because, of course, Microsoft Azure has not been informed about the redirection yet, and this is why we need to do some DNS settings yet. So let's go back into the DNS. And what we are going to do now is go first into our app service. And in the overview here in the dashboard, if we scroll down, we will see that we have a custom domain set up. And right now, as you can see, this is pointing to www.tailwindtraders.azurewebsites.net. So first of all, let's try to open this and see what is running at this address. You can see it's a very simple HTML-based application, all right, super simple, but it's just to kind of illustrate the point that this website is here and running. In reality, of course, we would have here an actual website. However, if we go to tailwindtraders.xyz, we don't have anything yet. All right, so let's go back to the app service. If we scroll down, we have custom domains, and then we can start by adding a custom domain to this app service. And here we are going to enter the custom domain www.tailwindtraders.xyz. So this is not an apex, all right? This is not an A name. This is going to be a canonical name, a C name, because of the www. Now, if we try to validate that, we see that the validation fails. It's because we have not proven that we own this domain like we discussed earlier. And here we have instructions. So we have this ASUID. This is App Service Unique ID. And we need to enter a new text record named ASUID.ww with this cryptic value that we just saw. So let's open another portal with the domain name services, and inside there we can go and set a new record set. The name of the record set is going to be asuid.www, and for the type we are going to choose a text record, and again ASUID is App Service Unique ID. And then if we were using another subdomain, for example functions.tailwindtrader.xyz, we would use asuid.functions. In that case we want www. So let's paste the values that we copied before, and then we are creating this record set. And so at this point, we can go back to the instructions, and now we see that the other thing that we need to do is create something else, which is a CNAME, which is pointing to the www or the subdomain. So it's a little bit different from the text record that we had before. So let's go and copy this value. All right, we are going to go back to the domain name service, to the DNS portal. Let's add a new record set. And inside there, this time we type www again, and then the CNAME, which is going to point to www.tailwindtraders.azurewebsites.net. So it's a redirection. Now here I'm changing the TTL, which is a time to leave, to 1 second. It's because I want to bypass the cache as much as possible, especially for later for the load balancing demo. Now typically you would set this value to 1 day or 1 week, like this you have some caching, but here I really want every time that a request is sent, I want this to be evaluated so that we can test the load balancing later. All right, so now this is done, which means that we can go back into our validation. First of all, of course, we need to save the record. And now we see that we have those two values which have been defined. And now we can go back into the app service. Let's go back to the validate button. And this time, after a short wait, because it takes a little time to be propagated, so maybe I need to refresh a couple of times, but after a short wait, we will see that we have proven that we own this domain. And as you can see, we have the availability and we have the ownership. So now we can click on Add Custom Domain. This is going to bring us back into the app service portal. And after a short wait, if I go and refresh, you will see that now we have two custom domains. We have the original one, which is a default one, and then we have another one, which is a custom domain that we own, but it's not secure at this point. That's okay, we'll do that later. Let's go back to the overview. We can go back to the window where we tried to load our website. Let's refresh that. And now, after a short wait, again, we should get the original page, but this time it is running with tailwindtraders.xyz. It is not secure, that's okay. This will be the point of the next demo. All right, so before we go into the next demo, I would like to talk about security because this is a super important topic. And here we can talk about the Transport Layer Security Certificate. This is TLS. Maybe sometimes you hear about TLS/SSL. SSL is really nothing else than an old version of TLS if you want, which is kind of obsolete. It still works. And so if you have a TLS certificate, it's actually also valid for SSL traffic. But here on Azure, we work with TLS certificate. And so it is an updated version of SSL, like I mentioned. And it's really a certificate that is used to encrypt web traffic. And not just web traffic, but really any traffic can be encrypted using TLS. But it is very often used for web traffic when you have this HTTPS protocol, the S standing for secure. And there are multiple considerations or multiple ways that you can use a certificate into a custom domain. For example, you can bring your own certification if you already have one, and we'll see a demo about that. You can buy those certificates, for example, to a registrar, or you can have some issued to you, or you can buy a certificate or build a certificate directly in Azure, and this is valid for certain services. This certificate could also be used and stored into Azure Key Vault. So you remember Azure Key Vault, we saw that for secrets, and I told you it's not just for secrets and connection strings, etc., but it can also be used for certificates, and this is here an example that you can have. Storing the certificate in Key Vault could be very interesting because it's going to make updating the certificate much easier, and this is really something you want to avoid. You don't want your certificate to expire. Those certificates have only a certain duration, a certain validity. You don't want them to expire because otherwise your traffic is going to be invalid, and of course this is very dangerous. You don't want this to happen. This has happened to many enterprises and many firms, so be careful about that. And so if you have the certificates in Key Vault, it's going to be much easier to update it in a central manner. So for the next demo, now that we have a custom domain, we are going to add a certificate on Azure App Service, and we'll see different ways to do that. For this demo, we go into the App Service portal here, and if we scroll down, you will see that under custom domains that we used before, we also have TLS SSL setting. So here I'm going to create a private key certificate. At this time we don't have anything. And for this demo, I'm going to create the App Service certificate directly inside the portal because it's easy to do, and also it's included into the App Service price. So it's quite convenient to do that. But there are also other ways that you can import a certificate. For example, you can have a certificate centrally managed into Key Vault and import it from there. You can also upload a certificate that you buy externally. We'll do that later. Or you can also import a certificate, another App Service certificate that is already existing. So let's go and create the App Service Managed certificate. This is for tailwindtraders.xyz with a www in front, all right? Now we can create it, and it's going to take just a couple of seconds to be created. But note that it's not applied yet. It's just been created, but it's not terminating our custom domain yet. To do that, first of all, we need to go back into the custom domain dialog. And here you see that we have a link saying add binding. So this is what we will do now. Now, in the Dropbox, we see our custom certificate that was just created. We are going to select SNI SSL. It's slightly different from IP-based SSL. In a nutshell, you could say that SNI SSL is allowing you for an unlimited number of domains. IP-based is limited to 10. Of course, there are other differences, but it's a little bit out of scope for this demo. So here I will just use SNI SSL all the time. So let's click on that, and then we can create the SSL binding. This is again going to take just a moment to configure. We see that it's secure now, and now I'm going to turn on HTTPS only. Like this, all the non-secure traffic is going to be automatically redirected to HTTPS. So I can test that. Let's go back into our website. All right, I'm going to enter HTTPS this time. It doesn't work yet because it takes a moment to propagate, but if I refresh after a few seconds, we should see that now the connection is secure. And in fact, we can verify the validity of the certificate. So basically, the public can do that as well and can also dive a little bit deeper if they want. So that is working fine. But now, of course, you may wonder what's going to happen if I try to enter tailwindtraders.xyz and not www.tailwindtraders.xyz. And I'm going to show you now that you can also configure that, but it's just a little bit different. So how is it working? Let's go back into the app service dialog. And again, we are going to add a new custom domain. And this time, this is an Apex domain, all right, without the www, without any subdomain. I'm going to validate that. And now we see that just like before, we don't have domain ownership yet. We didn't prove it. And the instructions are slightly different. The main difference here is that instead of using a CNAME record like before, we are going to use an A record. And the other difference is that now we have ASUID, App Service Unique ID, not .www, but directly just an empty one if you want. So let's go and add a record set. It's going to be ASUID.tailwindtraders.xyz. The type is going to be a text record, just like before. And now again, we are going to paste the values that we copied from the instructions. We can go and create that. And here for this particular demo, I set the TTL, the time to live, to 1 hour. It's fine for this demo. It doesn't really play a role here. Now we need to go and copy the IP address, which is the IP of our app service here. And this time we will create an A record. Let's go back to DNS. Let's add here a record, but this time we leave the name empty because that's the Apex. And we can copy here, or rather paste the IP address that we just copied before. So now we have those two new entries which are created. All right. If we go back to our website, we can try now the one that we had before, but first of all, we need, of course, to validate. And now the validation is okay. We can add the custom domain, the Apex custom domain. Let's go and refresh that. And now we see that it is working. It's still not secure. So let's go and add an SSL binding again. And this time the process for the SSL binding is going to be a little bit different because the managed app service that we use for www.tailwindtraders.xyz before can unfortunately not be used for an Apex domain. This is only for subdomains. So instead, what we are going to do now is add a binding, but this time we are going to upload a certificate that we purchased from a registrar, from an external registrar. Now, of course, you could also do that through Azure. But basically the process is very similar. It so happens that I have here a certificate which is already existing, which is a wildcard certificate that we can use for this demo. The certificate comes with a password. And now that I configure everything, I can go and upload this certificate. It's going to just take a moment. And so basically, just to recap, this is an external certificate that I purchased. So now I can choose a wildcard certificate, SNI again, and now I'm configuring the binding. And from this point onward, the traffic is going to be secure for tailwindtraders.xyz and also www.tailwindtraders.xyz. So we can verify that. Let's go back here to our overview. And we see indeed that the record is already registered. We can click on that and we see that now it's working for both the Apex domain as well as for the www subdomain. So this is good. We have basically secured our website. And just to recap, what we did is that we used here some TLS SSL bindings to do that after we declared the custom domain. So basically, we are ready to continue with our presentation. For the next demo, we are going to do the same thing. We are going to add a custom domain, but this time on Azure Function, on an Azure Function application, and you're going to see it's very, very similar. So back into the dashboard, we see that we already have a function application set up. And if we go back to it, you will see that it is very, very similar to before. Here we see that it is running right now on functions-tailwindtraders.azurewebsites.net. And if we want to use a custom domain here, the process is going to be very similar to what we did before with app service. So under custom domain here, we can click there, and then we are going to add a custom domain, and here we are going to use functions.tailwindtraders.xyz. So it is again a subdomain, all right? Let's click on validate. Same thing as before, it's going to fail the validation, and we can resolve that with the same steps. So we are going to set here a text record. Let's go back to our DNS. Let's click on add record. And here, because it's a function subdomain, we are going to use asuid.functions.tailwindtraders.xyz. All right, let's select a text record and we are going to paste here the values that we copied just before. Let's click that. Done. We can go back to the validation here and now we are going to set a canonical name, a CNAME record for functions-tailwindtraders.azurewebsites.net. Let's do that. This is going to be functions.tailwindtraders.xyz. That's a CNAME. And here I'm going to set again the TTL, the time to live, to 1 second. And we create that record. This is done. All right. So now if we go back to the validation, we are going to see that the validation is passing now. All right. This is here the 2 records that we set up. Let's go and validate again. This is very fast this time. Perfect. Let's add the custom domain. And as you can see, again, it is very similar to what we did before with app services. So if we refresh, we will have here the domain. Now, again, it is not secure at this time. So let's go and add a binding. And since we have this wildcard certificate that we used before, we can actually go and upload the same certificate. Now, one thing which is a little bit annoying when we do that is that we are uploading the same certificate in multiple locations. And of course, it means that if the certificate expires and we need to renew it, then we have to also upload this certificate in multiple locations. And what we can do to solve that is to upload the certificate in Azure Key Vault instead, and then after that to use that certificate instead. Like this, when we need to renew it, you're just going to go into Key Vault and you're going to renew the certificate in a central manner if you want. Okay, so now we are ready to go. The binding is created. And if we go back here to our overview, we see that we have now HTTPS and then functions.tailwindtraders.xyz. Again, it takes a short moment to propagate. So after a short moment, we can refresh that. And now we see that the redirection and the certificate are working just fine. And now we will do a custom domain again, but this time for Azure Storage. And as you will see, it's also a little bit different. Okay, so this demo is going to work a little bit differently. We are going to set a custom domain for a storage account. So here I already have a storage account created. And if I go into there, we will see that in the Storage Explorer, we already have a blob container which is set up, and I already have an image inside there. So let's go and copy the URL, and this will be the original address that we want to replace with a custom domain. As you can see, this address is fairly complex. All right, so we are going to replace that with a custom domain, and then we are going to show you also how you can secure that and still serve those images under HTTPS. So in order to do that, we go and find the well-known dialog, which is a custom domain dialog. I'm going to enter here the domain name, and notice that the UI is a little bit different. We have also instructions, but those instructions are different than before. So I'm going to paste here, or rather to type here, storage.tailwindtraders.xyz. I'm going to save, and saving is going to trigger a validation, which is going to fail in that case. But don't despair, we have the instructions here, and we know how to create a CNAME record with our DNS provider. So I'm going to copy that and go into the DNS dialog again. And there, what I'm going to do is add a new record, and this record is going to be for a CNAME. Now notice that at this point, I'm not actually going to create a text record. This is not necessary according to the instructions. So I'm going to copy here the original domain that I want to point my CNAME to. Let's do that. It's going to be a CNAME record. We are going to paste here the alias, and then I can save that. This is creating a new record in the DNS. And here the other instruction is optional. You can select one or the other instruction. So at this point, if I save, it should go through the validation this time. And now we are ready to go and check if this domain is working. So let's go into the Storage Explorer. Note that if I copy the URL of the image here, it's still going to give me the original, the complicated URL, but I can easily modify that to the URL and check if my custom domain is working now. Okay, /images/Microsoft Azure.png. And the connection is not private, this is correct, but if I decide to continue anyway, we see that the custom domain is resolving properly now. So now the big question is, how can we secure that and continue to serve those images over HTTPS with a secure certificate? And as you will see, the process is going to be a little bit different here. So let's go back to our storage account portal. And here, if I go down a little bit, you will see that under the custom domain menu that we are used to, normally we used to have a TLS SSL domain, but here it is failing at the moment. And so in order to secure the traffic here, what we will do is we will have to set a CDN endpoint. CDN is Content Delivery Network, and this is basically what we can secure with our certificate now. So let's create a new endpoint for our traffic. We are just going to here give it a name, and then after that we select Standard Microsoft Pricing Tier, and we set the CDN endpoint name. Here it could be anything we want as long as it's unique, because anyway nobody is ever going to see this address. So I set that to storage-twt, and then I select here the host name, which is our original address that we want to replace now, and then at this point I can click Create. All right, so the CDN endpoint is being created, and when it is ready, after a short wait, we are going to be able to secure this CDN endpoint with a certificate, and again, you will see that the process is a little bit different from what we did before. So now this host name exists, we can dive into it, and now we are going to add a custom domain to that. Let's do that. So we are going to select here the custom host name, which is going to be securestorage.tailwindtraders.xyz. This box is validating, and as you can see, it is failing the validation, but again, we have some instructions on how to do that. And in order to pass the validation here, we are going to have to create a new DNS record, which is pointing to this original endpoint name. So let's do that into the DNS. Okay, going back into the DNS, I'm going to set a new record, and the name is going to be securestorage.tailwindtraders.xyz. We know from the instructions it has to be a CNAME, and this is the address which nobody will ever see. This is the Azure service address, if you want, which it is going to point to. All right, so now at this point we can refresh the validation. Now this box is a little bit weird because it doesn't have a validate button, so I'm going to just modify the value, and that's going to trigger the validation again. All right, it's just taking a few seconds to propagate, but now we see that the validation is complete. Perfect. So now the custom domain name is going to be created for the CDN, and now this is the value that we are going to be able to secure. So let's go back to the overview, let's go back to the custom domain, and as you can see here, the host name has been created, but notice that the custom HTTPS is disabled at this time, and this is what we want to enable. But before we do that, let's go back into our web browser, and we are going to see how this image is looking like if I decide to use my custom domain for the CDN. So that's securestorage.tailwindtraders.xyz. And if I try that, you see that it doesn't work under HTTP, all right, because we have specified that we want HTTPS, and so this is not going to work over HTTP. However, over HTTPS, what's going to happen is that this image is going to be served, but of course, we have the warning that it's not private because the certificate is not valid yet. So we can do that, we can go back into our portal, and this is where we can actually say that we want to use a certificate for that. And this is going to happen here in the Azure portal again. So let's go in custom domain. I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to set here configure custom domain HTTPS, and I'm going to use here a CDN manage certificate, which is going to be created by Azure. So like this, I don't need to use my own certificate for this particular feature here. All right, it's going to take a moment to save the changes. And now what's going to happen is that it's going to start a whole propagation, which is going to take a moment to complete. So we can always follow the status here. As you can see, it is submitting the request. And here, because we have a relatively small subset of data and a small CDN, it's going to be quite fast, but it could take minutes to complete in a real-life scenario. And of course, at any time, you can go back to this page and then you can follow what's going on. So now we see that the domain validation is being processed. And of course, this is going to take a while. So here, for this particular demo, we are not going to wait that the whole thing is being processed in order to save time. But basically, if I come back to that in a few minutes, then we will see that the validation has been complete. Everything has worked fine, and now we can serve the images over HTTPS and over the CDN using a custom domain name. All right, so let's talk a little bit about networking strategies. And one thing which is probably true is that in most cases, you want to avoid hard coding IP addresses in your system because IP addresses can change dynamically, so it's probably not a good idea. And basically, at some point, it's probably going to come back and haunt you. And this is why DNS and all those CNAMEs, those redirections, is probably going to be a better idea. Don't forget that on an app service, you can have multiple custom domains. You're going to have also testing, staging if you use some slots. And also, you can also use DNS with Azure Storage. And so we saw that in the demo already. You can also have custom domain on CDN, for example, for Azure Storage, like we did before, and also on Azure Functions. So this is a little bit a summary of what we saw if you want. And so let's talk about load balancing now. And so load balancing is kind of a little bit out of the scope of this session, but it has to do with DNS as well. And so we thought that we would show you also an example of how you can set this up in Azure. But of course, there are a lot of different options depending on what you're trying to do. For example, Azure Front Door, we'll talk a little bit about Azure Front Door at the very end of this session. Azure Traffic Manager, which we'll use in a demo, but also things like Application Gateway, Azure Load Balancer, etc. And so depending on what you do, you can choose a different option. Now, we could talk for a very long time, for a whole session or more, about traffic balancing and load balancing. And so if you go to this aka.ms link here, it's going to bring you to a page where those options are discussed in a lot more detail. So we are going to use here in the demo the Azure Traffic Manager, and it's a DNS-based load balancing, so it's going to do a redirection depending on different rules that you set up. And those could be, for example, what is a server which is the closest to the user sending the request. Or it could be just a weighted approach where you say, okay, certain servers are going to handle more traffic than others, etc., etc. And so as you can see, this is for any HTTP address. It's not just for Azure, but here in the demo, we are going to use it to redirect the traffic to app.tailwindtraders.xyz to a single custom domain between 2 or possibly 3, 4, etc. different servers. So let's see a demo for that. So let's go back to the portal, and here we see that we have those 2 app services that we set up. The first one is in Central US, and then the other one is in Europe. And then we have this traffic manager, which we are going to use. And so if we take a look at those 2 applications, we see that those are, again, some very simple HTML. One is showing Central, one is showing Europe. Now, of course, in a normal situation, both websites would show exactly the same content. But here I wanted the content to be different so that we can have the proof that the traffic manager is essentially working, all right? So now if we go back to the traffic manager, we are going to be able to set some endpoints. And so the traffic manager, I already created it in order to gain some time. But if I go to the list of endpoints, we will see that those are empty. So let's go and add a new endpoint. Now this is fairly easy. we have different endpoints that we can use. We are going to add an Azure endpoint, but there are also different endpoints that you can use. For example, external endpoint or a nested endpoint. This can be quite complex, and it's a little bit out of the scope of this presentation. So here we want to use an Azure endpoint. We are just going to give it a name, and we select App Service. Now, because this is an Azure App Service, immediately we have a choice that we can select, and here we are taking the central app service, and we are going to give it a weight of 1. So here we are using an approach which is called round robin or weighted approach, which means that if everyone has a weight of 1, everyone will get the same probability of answering the request. All right, so now we have added the central endpoint. Let's add another endpoint using exactly the same process for Europe, all right? And as you can see, by default, it's set to 2. If I leave it to 2, it will mean that this particular endpoint will serve twice as much traffic as the other one in a report of 2 to 1. And so I want to change that back to 1 so that both websites have exactly the same probability of serving the traffic. All right, so now we have this endpoint defined. We are going to save it. And then once this is saved, we are going to have to set up the custom domain on the app service. So let's go back to our dashboard, and then we are going to go into the central app service. All right, and now we know the process. We go to custom domain, and you see that we already have here a custom domain which was assigned, and that was done automatically when we created the endpoint in the traffic manager. Now, one thing we need to be careful about is that when we create the CNAME, instead of pointing to central-herointraders.azure websites.net like before, we are going to have to point it to this to the endpoint, to the traffic manager custom, the traffic manager endpoint. All right, so we need to be careful here. So we are going to name this custom domain app.herointraders.xyz, and that's going to be the same custom domain for both endpoints. And just like before, validation fails, it's normal. So we need to add the text record and the CNAME record. And this is where we need to be careful. We need to use here the endpoint, the traffic manager address, and not here the app service address. So that's the place where we need to be a little bit careful. So let's go back to DNS. We know the process by now. We add a new record. We are going to call that ASUID.app, and that's going to be the same one for both. And then we add a text record, which is going to prove that we actually own this domain. All right, let's go. And now if I add a new record set, and this time we are going to add the CNAME, and here this is where I need to be a little bit careful to set the TTL unit, the time to leave, to 1 second, because I don't want the value to be cached. I really want the value every time that the request is received, that the traffic manager needs to evaluate the value and to do basically the full request response path. All right, let's put the alias of the traffic manager end site. And so we see that this is here at trafficmanager.net. We are going to save that. And once this is done, we can go back here and validate. Now the validation is working. We can now click on Add Custom Domain. All right. And once this is done, here we can go and refresh. And then we are going to see that this custom domain is defined. Now let's do the same thing for the European endpoint, all right, for the European version of the site. So let's go to custom domain. And again, it's exactly the same thing, except that this time it's going to go faster because, of course, the validation is going to pass this time because we have already done the work of preparing the validation, creating the text record and everything. So now we can directly click on custom domain, and this is going to add the custom domain to this app service. Now, of course, the last thing we need to do is add the SSL binding, because at the moment the traffic is not going to be secure. And so I'm going to choose here app.herointraders.xyz for the domain. I'm going to upload the same certificate that I used before. It's a wildcard certificate, so it's going to work. And again, as a reminder, if you put your certificate into Key Vault, you don't need to upload it many times. And if you renew the certificate, you don't need to renew it everywhere. You just need to renew it in Key Vault. All right, the rest is exactly the same as before. Perfect. So now we have our Europe site set up. And now, well, surprise, surprise, we need to do the same thing again for the central version of the app service. So let's go here again into custom domains. And now we see the custom domain, we can add the binding, and it's exactly the same as before. We are going to use the same domain, of course, because both run exactly the same. Let's add here the PFX certificate. Let's add the password. We can save. And when this is done, we can configure it just like before. All right, SSL binding is being configured. It takes just a moment. And now basically we have our two sites which are secure and which use the same custom domain. So how is it going to work properly? If I go here and click on app.herointraders.xyz, all right, it's going to open a new window. And in that case, I'm going to get, well, here we go. We get the European version of the website. But of course, it could be also the central version. It depends. It really depends on the traffic manager. And now I'm going to here copy the same URL. I'm going to open an in private window so that the session is not saved at all. And now you see that I get the other app service. I get the central version. Like I told you, there are many ways to do load balancing and also many ways on Azure with Azure services. And so another service that is interesting to know is Azure Front Door. Now, we don't have really a lot of time to talk about it, and it's also going to be a little bit out of scope of a DNS discussion. But it's good to know that you have the possibility to do things like that. For example, if you have a path which is /images, then the traffic, you can redirect it to, for example, an image CDN for a storage account. And then if you have /script, then you're going to redirect to another CDN storage specifically for script. And of course, you can do that for different applications and different paths of your application. So again, we don't really have time to go deeper into front door here, but I wanted you to know that this is available, and then you can go back to the AKMS link that you gave us, that we gave us before, in order to learn more. So in review, what did we see in this presentation? First of all, we talked about generic information about DNS and domain name services. And then after that, we saw demos on how to set custom domains in Azure services. And if you remember, we saw app services, we saw function applications, and we saw storage, complete not just for the custom domain, but also for TLS security certificates, so that we could handle secure traffic with HTTPS. Then after that, we did a demo about load balancing using Azure Traffic Manager. And finally, we just said a few words about Azure Front Door. So two different ways to handle load balancing and traffic management. All right, so a call to action, it's always good to continue learning. And if you go there to ak.ms/mod40, this is where you will find more information about all that. We have curated a certain number of links for you. I want to thank you so much for your attention in this presentation, and hopefully this answers a lot of questions that you had about DNS. So that was module 4 of this learning path. In here, we talked about configuring your application, running it in a secure manner, using certificates for TLS and HTTPS. We also configured the custom domain name. And in the next module, this is where we'll start talking about monitoring your application, because now that it is running great, this is really the time to optimize the performance and also, of course, to optimize your cost. So let's have a 10-minute break first, and then I'll see you for module 5. Welcome back from the break, and welcome to module 5 of this learning path. This is the last module, and this is where we will talk about monitoring your application. We have fantastic monitoring solutions on Azure, one thing called Azure Monitor, which is really huge and super useful. We'll also talk about debugging your application in production. That sounds pretty scary, but also pretty exciting, and bear with me because I'll show you all the details. We have a lot of demo for you, so let's get started with module 5. So this session is a very important one because it is talking about monitoring, and monitoring is something that you should always do every day, every moment of the day, because it is going to gather some data which later can help you identify the issues that you might have. And of course, as you can imagine, monitoring can be a little bit tricky sometimes. There are a few reasons for that, especially when you work, of course, with production applications, which is really what you want to monitor. It can be really hard to get the exceptions, to get the logs, basically to get data about your running application, because this application is going to be on a server. When you're running this application in the public cloud, it's going to be on a server which is pretty far away from you, right? So you want to have a cloud provider who is instrumenting the infrastructure and giving you this data so that you can later analyze it and study it. Also, the configuration is going to be different. It's not your own machine anymore. It's not everything on the debug machine, and then we try it out. You have a different configuration. Maybe you have multiple servers with a load balancer between them. Maybe you're also going to have some dedicated server, for example, SQL Server for the data and ASP.NET on IIS, for example, for the web application. The scale is going to be different. You're going to be serving thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands, millions of customers. And of course, that can cause some big issues. The data is different. This is also production data, not debug data. So maybe suddenly you have a different format that you didn't really account for when you were doing the development. Getting the tools can be tricky as well. Which tools work well? Well, a lot of that is based on experience, but if you're in Azure, we have that experience, we have gathered that experience, and we are going to be able to make some recommendations to you. One thing which is also important to remember is that your application is not running isolated on a server. There are all kinds of things around it, okay? You have some infrastructure. Maybe some of this infrastructure is on your premise and some is in the cloud, in the case of a hybrid application, which of course happens very often. You have the application itself, and this is your code, so you can instrument it. But even that sometimes can be tricky, because pushing a new version of the application, if you don't have a continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline set up, can be tricky. And finally, the network, you know what we say, right? If something goes wrong, it's usually DNS, right? And networking can be very, very complicated to set up, and it is important to monitor it. You will also have protections like firewalls and network security groups and all kinds of things which you need to monitor to understand really what's happening in your application. So, sorry about that. So in this session, we are going to see a few components and a few tools which are going to help you to monitor, and we are going to start with Azure Monitor. Azure Monitor is really the all-encompassing solution of monitoring in Azure. This is what we use to monitor literally every piece of infrastructure that we have, and we'll discover how you can use it. And then we'll dive into application insights. Like the name shows, it's a little bit more focused on your application. All right, it's a part of Azure Monitor. It is something that you can add via an SDK to your application. We have SDKs for JavaScript, Java, of course, .NET, etc. But it is also built into Azure, and so even without instrumenting your code, you can already turn on application insights. And if you remember, in the second session of this learning path, when we migrated the web application, the very first thing we did was turning on application insights for the application. Even though it is an old version of ASP.NET 3.5, we were able to do that. And we'll talk more about that in this session. We are also going to check the logs, and we gather tons and tons of data, and sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to make sense of the data, and this is where log analytics can help you. So we will see how you can write some queries. You can even share those queries with your team members. You can create tables or graphs in different formats, and really that's going to help you to filter what's going on, to identify exactly what's going on in your application. Then we'll use a feature of Visual Studio Enterprise, which allows us to debug an application in production, a .NET application. Note that snapshot debugging is integrated into Azure, and so you can already access it in Azure and gather really a lot of data. But if in addition you have Visual Studio Enterprise, you can download the debug snapshot, and then you can open it and debug in Visual Studio. We'll see a demo about that. And finally, sometimes you want some rich notifications. You definitely want at least an email or an SMS or even a push notification to your phone when something happens. If your site goes down, for example, you don't want to wait until Monday morning to find out that your site was not running during the weekend, okay? So this is something you can very easily do with monitoring and alerts. And then we'll also see how you can use a Logic application, for example, Logic Apps. It's a serverless solution on Azure to create a complex notification system. In our case, we are going to use Teams, but it could be also something else, for example, a ticketing system, etc., etc. So without further ado, let's dive into Azure Monitor and Application Insights. Azure Monitor is a unified monitoring system. It's going to collect metrics and logs, and then it's going to save them into a big common store, a unified store. And so that makes things much easier for you later to analyze, because you know that what you're looking for, the information you're looking for, is going to be in that store. Later, you can run some data-driven insights on it, meaning that you have diagnostics tools. We are going to see some of them, analytics tools. You can even run some machine learning algorithms. For example, if you want to detect anomalies in your data, let's say that, I don't know, every day you have 5 errors into your server, because you know errors happen, and maybe it's just a error 500, right, a server error, and then suddenly one day you have 50 of those. That's unusual, okay? You want to be notified when this happens. So these kind of things can be done. And you also have some integration, of course, into DevOps. For example, if you want to get notified or you want to run a different pipeline if something happens. All kinds of issue management tools, for example, security information and event management tools, SIEM, or ITSM, IT security management tools. So basically, first-party tools, we have our own tools, but you can also integrate that into third-party tools if you want. This is, like I mentioned, a unified monitoring system. All right, we collect information from different sources. We'll talk more about that in the next slide. And we then can analyze this data using different tools. For example, we already mentioned application insights. We'll see more about that in a moment. But we also have some container monitoring if you are running Kubernetes or even Docker. We have VM monitoring solutions. Now, of course, you need to install and configure those yourself, but we already monitor the infrastructure. We have dashboards, and we'll see some of those in the Azure portal. You can build views if you want, but you can also integrate everything into Power BI. Power BI is our data visualization tool. It's really awesome. You can do some very powerful dashboards, and those dashboards are going to be continuously updated, and they are going to show you the health of your application in real time. You have workbooks where you can go and run some data transformation or some data analytics. To analyze the logs, like I mentioned, we have tons of data. We have Metrics Explorer, we have Log Analytics. We'll talk more about Log Analytics later. And you can also create alerts if you want to be notified, or you can also auto-scale your application. Remember, in the second session of this learning path, we configured auto-scale for our web application, and then we tested using a tool called Artillery. We bombed the application, with requests, and then we saw that it was automatically scaling to a second server, which is exactly what we configured. And then you can also integrate. We will talk about Logic Apps for complex integration. You can also do event hubs. Event hubs is basically an event collecting system if you want. And then after that, you can integrate with other things like Azure Functions, etc. Or you can also simply export that to different tools using our API. So using a third-party tool, for example, you can always ask our APIs for data and have this data being exported in various formats. So what do we collect exactly? Well, we collect what we call signals, metrics, logs, alerts, and we collect them from different sources. First of all, at the bottom, we have the Azure tenant. That's really the account management system, if you want, Azure Active Directory, the identity solution that we have on Azure. And so already at that level, we are going to collect information. For example, if an account is created or deleted or logging in, etc. And then on top of that, we have the Azure subscription. One account can have multiple subscriptions, all right? This is where the resource manager lives. You may have heard about ARM, the Azure Resource Manager. This is a very, very important component because it's going to manage the lifestyle of all your resources. And then after that, on top of that, you have the resources themselves, starting with the hardware, all right? So the servers, the storage accounts, the network security groups, like all the networking system, the virtual machines running on it, because even if you're using platform as a service, even if you're using even serverless functions, it is going to run on a VM, and you want to be able to monitor what's going on there, all right? And then after that, if you're running your own VM, you're going to install a guest operating system on the virtual machine. And then if it's your own VM, you have to instrument that yourself, for example, with Windows performance counters or Linux syslog, sorry. But if we are running our own operating system, for example, platform as a service or in serverless solutions, then the operating system is there. You don't really have access to it, but you have access to the logs. And then after that, on top of that, this is your application. And that's where you can have telemetry about the user. You can have, of course, the logs. You can have custom events that you can add using, for example, the Application Insight SDK. So that brings us to Application Insight. Application Insight is a complete monitoring solution for your application. And it's going to help you to get the big picture about your application. You see that you can build some very nice dashboards, for example, which really, in the glimpse of an eye, is going to help you understand what's going on in your application. And we'll talk about some of those components a little bit later, such as application map, failures, you also have possibility to monitor your application in real time. So that's really cool. This is going to allow you to find and fix a problem. If you have a problem, you're going to start by checking the failures, most probably in Application Insight, and that's going to allow you to dig into the problem. And also, when your application runs well, I said that already a few times, this is the best time to actually optimize it, optimize the performance, learn about your application, and see where you can be even better for your users. We have different sources of telemetry in Insight. You know, we are monitoring from the outside to the inside, so we have really a whole landscape. We check the user behavior, like how long do they spend on which page, these kind of things, where do they go next. You can, of course, add your own custom traces and events, all right, using the SDK. And we're also observing the application behavior, like, for example, how long does it take to start? Is it crashing, etc. We also observe, like I mentioned before, the infrastructure performance, so it goes also a little bit into Azure Monitor, so that you have a correlated situation, because if your application is running on multiple servers, maybe you have a load balancer, maybe you have some requests going to SQL Server, etc., then, of course, you need to know what your request is doing. And this is where here this correlation is going to help you. Basically, every request can be traced from the client, which is often a web client or a mobile client, all the way down to the SQL Server and back. You have the possibility to check the logs, all right? Logs are very rich, like very, very rich, and so this is why you need to protect them. We have role-based access control, where you can say that only certain people have access to the logs. You have, like I mentioned before, some machine learning algorithm to check, for example, anomalies in your data. And so you have the possibility to go and write some queries using a language that we call Custo to build some complex queries, which are a little bit similar to SQL queries. They kind of look a little bit the same, but there are some differences, and we'll see later how you can do that directly in the web portal. You can really dig deeper in forms of tables, but also in forms of complex graphs. For example, this is here the country of origin of people who visited my website recently, as you can see in the query, in the last 24 hours. So it's interesting to know that. Let's see a demo and explore Azure Monitor and Application Insights a little bit more. So we are going to start in the Azure portal, and of course, like everything I do, we have different tools that you can use. The Azure portal is kind of a nice place to go and get started. And here you can see that for every component that we have some information in forms of graphs and in forms of data. So here, for example, this is the utilization of the compute of my SQL database over the last hour. So we see what happened. That helps us to know if we have some activity there. Let's go into Key Vault. Again, the same thing, right? We have some data. So here we see, for example, the total requests to Key Vault. And this is all correlated together. So you can see that if I pass the mouse on the graph, it's also showing this line on the next graph. Like this, it makes it really easier to read. And notice a small pin in the top right corner of the graph. This allows you to pin the graph to your dashboard. So you can always put a graph to your dashboard and see what's happening in really the glance of an eye, and you can pin really different things. Here I modified the duration of the graph, like this you can see over the last hour. And of course you can also add different metrics, like for example here we see latency, availability, etc., etc. So that's interesting to know how busy your Key Vault is. Maybe you need to scale that up to a different plan. For example, you know that in Key Vault we have the standard plan and the premium plan, etc., etc. So this is really giving you a lot of information about what's going on in your resources and really your resources throughout the whole landscape of your application. So that's quite precious and quite useful. All right. Let's go now to our web application, because this is what we really want to observe and possibly optimize. All right, so here again, you see the different graphs that you have. And again, those graphs, right, you can put them into your dashboard if you want, simply by pinning them to the current dashboard, so you can build some visualization systems. Everything is correlated, all right? So this is all moving together, and like this you see really what's going on. And here you see already one point of entry to application insights. There are different points of entry in your web application where you can start application insights and configure it. Remember, we did that already in the second session of this learning path. We actually turned on application insights. But now that we had time to collect the information, then we are going to go and explore that. So let's move on to the application insight demo. So what I'm going to do here is, here I am back into the Azure portal. This is yet another point of entry to application insights, as you can see. And here, this is the data. You may have seen that already in the second session of this learning path. This is where you specify what is being collected. And as you see here, this is a .NET application. So we are collecting some things by default already. For example, profiler information, debug snapshots. We'll talk about that in a moment. SQL commands even. If you are using Java, JavaScript, then you have an SDK that you can add, even Python. And like this, you can configure your application this way. Now we are really inside the application insights data. As you can see, we have more graphs. We see that we have a bunch of failed requests that we are going to have to investigate. Not quite sure what happened here. And here we have the different graphs. So now let's check some of the components of application insights. This is the application map. It's going to show you the components of your applications. And you can change here the view, because remember we did migrate the data, and so initially the application was getting its data from a virtual machine here. So it was running SQL Server on a virtual machine on premise. And now you see that if we go to the last 30 minutes, all the requests have gone to the new database, which is our database running on Azure. So now we can see a little bit more information. You see that this node is red. Okay, red is not very good. It's probably some failures. And indeed, we see that we have some failures. So let's go and investigate that. We are going to dive a little bit deeper. Those are the failures that we see. We have quite a lot around 9:50 p.m. here. So we see that it has to do with the GET. So it's really the top request, which is already failing. Let's dive into that. And now we see basically the end-to-end transaction, all right, from the GET to an exception. And we see this exception is a system.argument exception. So as a reminder, this is, again, an ASP.NET application. And we saw that there was something said about @Microsoft.KeyVault, keyword not supported. So we probably have an error here in the connection string going to the SQL Server, because remember that the connection string is in Key Vault, and we have configured that in the second session of this learning path. We can also dive into the failures directly here from this menu. All right, so you see exactly the same menu except from a different point of entry. So application map is always where I like to start. And from here we can also go into the log analytics. So let's go and see all the requests here in the log analytics. And we see that we have a start and an end date time set directly into the queries. This is this Custo programming language, query language that I mentioned before. We see that we have really a lot of failed requests here. This is actually what we have queried. You can select, of course, different columns if you want to see things. You can even see things in a chart result, which here in that particular case doesn't quite make sense, I would say, but you can also change the graph, the graph format. And then also one thing which is really cool is that when you have a query, you can actually share it with your team. So you can copy a link to the query, and then you can send it to somebody else. So here I'm going to simulate that by opening a new web browser. I paste here the link that I got. I am authenticated, and if the user that you are sending that to, or the customer, or the team members that you are sending that to has the same permissions, you can see the query directly in his web browser. So that's really cool because it allows you to share information. We, of course, can teach you queries, all right? So we have some example queries. We also have a full-blown documentation. Here you see that the time duration is set in the query directly. I'm going to remove it. Now notice that you can change the request in the UI directly. So here we have the response time over the past 24 hours, all right? And now I can change that to the last hour if I want to concentrate on something special. Okay, we can run the query. And here again, you could change the chart format if you want. If you want to put the time range or really any other information into the query directly, you can do that. You see that you have some IntelliSense helping you to type, all right? So it is good, also a good way to learn about the format. And so here I'm putting the timestamp to 12 hours ago. So I'm seeing everything which is younger than 12 hours. All right, let's go back into application insights to the top. Now we have the live metrics that I wanted to show you. This is a dashboard that you can put, for example, on a big screen into your project room. And I'm going to hit the server a few times. So let's go and enter a couple of queries. All right, I'm going to refresh that. Like this, we have three different queries, three different requests, and now you can see those three requests here in the dashboard. So basically, in real time, you see exactly what went on. And of course, now I have an average of 1 request per second over the past 5 seconds. You see that it is handled by one server, so that's good. When we did the auto-scaling demo in the second session of this learning path, we saw that it was scaling out to 2 servers. So that's really cool. We can see really in real time what's happening. We also have a very important component, the application performance monitor. And here you see that we have most of our requests, I would say, around 290 milliseconds. So after that, it's up to you to decide. And we know that it's an ASP.NET 3.5 application. It's not the fastest server that we have, right? We have ASP.NET Core, which is way faster. We see that we have some requests which were much faster than what we had. So using after that the application map, for example, you can identify which components are causing the delay. And you see that here we have the post, which is quite slow, right? It's 2.12 seconds. But at the same time, we only have 3 requests. And so maybe it's not totally representative. So over the course of the life cycle of your application, the lifetime of your application, you're going to be able to refine that. And then you can totally go and see what's going on with my application and can I actually optimize the performance. All right, so this is something that is cool because we were able to see the overall health of our application, but we also saw that we have a problem and we are going to try to debug that. And in a .NET Core application, for example, you can use something called snapshot debugging, which is really cool. Snapshot debugging is a feature that is in Azure, so you can have that automatically turned on for your .NET applications. And then after that, it's going to allow you to debug in production. And I know that it sounds really scary because you don't want to connect to your production server in debug mode and start debugging, but it's really not what it is. It is going to collect information. Actually, it's collecting a dump of your application when there is an exception. And then you can download that, you can analyze that, you can check even the code. It supports also distributed applications. So if you have multiple servers, you have maybe load balancers, you have different clients, etc., it's going to allow you to identify exactly what went wrong. And of course, because of the wealth of information that you have in a snapshot like that, you're even able to decompile the code and to see the source code. You need to secure the access, and this is why we have role-based access control for that. So basically what it's going to do, if you have a complex application with multiple servers, you have your load balancer, multiple clients, it's going to allow you to really pinpoint the one server which is causing the issue. It's going to allow you to pinpoint the clients who are associated to this server, which client is having the issue at the moment. And then it's really going to bring things together, just like you have on your debug machine, on your development machine. You very often have just like one server and one client. Maybe even the server is running on the client because it's debug. And of course, that makes debugging very much easier. And this is what the debug snapshot is going to offer you. So let's see a demo. Now for this demo, I'm going to go into another application. This is the e-commerce front store of Tailwind Traders, which is running ASP.NET Core. And this is why I have more here instrumentation possibilities with .NET Core. So this is the application, and I heard that people cannot go to the shopping cart, that they have errors, which is of course terrible because the shopping cart is really a key component of your shopping experience. I think we all agree. And now we see that if I log in and I go to my shopping cart, indeed I have some issues. So this is really bad, really bad. And of course I need to investigate that as fast as possible and see what's going on. So let's go back into the portal. We are going to see how we are configured. We see that in Application Insight, indeed, we have a bunch of failed requests here. This is really not good at all. Let's go into the application map. Now, this application is slightly more complex. You see that you have the client, the web application, and then we have a NoSQL store. It's a Cosmos DB instance with Mongo API, and this is where things seem to be failing. So if we dive into that, we see that indeed we have something which seems to be related to the MongoDB. All right, so this is already a good clue, I would say, to check out what's going on. Let's dive into the use. And here you see there is a small icon. It was quite fast, but we are going to see this icon again. It indicates that we have a debug snapshot. So here, if we see the end-to-end transaction, we see that the issue seems to be happening in the shopping cart. This is the icon that I mentioned. If I click on it, it allows me to open the debug snapshot. It is protected by role, so I need to authenticate myself in order to see the information. And now you can see all the information that you get. It's really a lot. You have the call stack, you have the variables, everything that you would see in Visual Studio when you debug a .NET application. We see the value, all right? And we saw something about authentication failed. Let's see the decompiled code. Now, in that case, it doesn't really help me much because it's a MongoDB driver, and but at least it helps me to know exactly where I was when the exception happened. Now, one thing which is cool is that you can download the snapshot. So I'm going to save it here to my desktop. And then if you use Visual Studio Enterprise, then you can go and check it out. So this is the source code. I just forked it from the GitHub repo. Notice that it is running .NET Core, so it gives me a little bit more instrumentation possibilities. And indeed, I did add here Microsoft.applicationinsights.asp.NET Core. It's a package. As soon as you add the package, you can have your snapshots. You don't need to change the code. Just showing you that I'm using indeed Visual Studio Enterprise here. And now it means that I can go and open the diag session file, which is this snapshot that we just downloaded. All right, let's load it. It's going to take a moment to load because there is really a lot of information. And so what is this file? It's really a dump of your application and all the dependencies at the moment of the exception. And here you can see that we have collected really a lot of information. All right, let's go down here to see the different modules. All right, you see that you have a lot of things. I think this particular diag session file was around 100 megabytes. And now you can actually use Visual Studio to debug. All right, you can debug your native code, your managed code, or a mixed session if you want. It's going to load symbols because, of course, this is production. All right, we don't have symbols in the dump. We don't have those in the server. I'm going to stop it because I just want to show you the debug experience without loading all the symbols. You can even download source code if this source code is available on GitHub and on a repo that you have access to. And now we see the exception. We can see the details of the exception, and basically it's going to help us to understand what went on. We see that the authentication failed. That's interesting. So it seems to be really related to the connection string of the MongoDB, which is actually a Cosmos DB database. Notice that you can, of course, decompose the source code. We saw that in the Azure portal already. So let's go and investigate. All right, we see that the Mongo connection string is saved in Key Vault, and it's interesting. This identifier seems new to me. So the good thing is that in Azure we log everything, and so you can totally see who changed the identifier. All right. Indeed, we see there is a current version, there is a new version, if you wish, of the connection string. It was created not long ago. Let's go and check here the secret value. And here we see immediately that there is a typo. This 2 shouldn't be there. It's absolutely wrong. The server doesn't have a 2. This is actually the old version, the one that was working fine. Let's go and show it. We see that we don't have the 2 here. So basically somebody changed the connection string for some reason and messed it up. So I'm going to go back and fix the problem because that's the first priority. But then later, at any time, I can go back into my Key Vault. I can see who accessed that particular Key Vault at what time, who messed up the connection string, so that not necessarily to blame them or shame them. That's not the point, but really just to make sure that it never happens again. All right, so there is some teaching to do here. All right, let's go and change the configuration. As soon as the configuration is changed, now we revert it to the old connection string, and probably it should work fine. Let's go back to the website. I'm going to load the shopping cart, and now, okay, we see 0 items, which is correct. The shopping cart works now. So basically we have fixed the problem without having to redeploy anything or whatever, but it was really helping us to see what was going on into our application and to fix it. All right, so that's really cool, but we also want to be notified when something happens. Now, I don't know for you, but I know that for me, the worst experience that can happen is when a website that I'm managing goes down and I don't know about it. And then suddenly, maybe I have a very, very complex notification system, which is Twitter. Somebody's going to reach out to me on Twitter and say, hey, dude, your site is down. What's going on with that? And this is really a horrible experience because you're supposed to know what's going on with your site, okay? And this is where notifications can really help you. And the cool thing is that we have that built into Azure. So you can act on errors, all right? Because logs are fantastic. After the fact, you will go back into your logs and you will find out what happened. But you also need to know that something happened. And again, like I mentioned in the intro, right? You don't want to know on Monday morning that you didn't sell anything during the weekend because the site was down. This is really the worst thing that can happen. So you want email, you want SMS. You even want push notifications. We have an application that I'm going to show you later called the Azure app. It runs on iOS and Android. It's really a very, very nice application. You can do all kinds of things. And I will be totally honest with you. When I started using the app, I was thinking, oh, it's a little bit of a gadget, because what can I do? I can, okay, cool. I can go and check my Azure resources. But when I learned that I can do push notifications to that app, then suddenly something lit up in my head because I was like, okay, it means that I can really get some detailed information about my application, even when I'm, outside of the house and I'm doing things. And we all know you don't really want to have notifications on your phone, work notifications on your phone when you're out of the house. But, sometimes it's really good to have them if something happens. And then you can also build complex actions, for example, with logic apps, with serverless functions, etc. So one thing that we are going to use here is a monitoring, the availability monitoring capacity that we have in Application Insight. It's going to help you to check your web servers. And then it's going to allow you to set alerts and say, all right, if it goes down for example, 2 minutes, then I want to be notified with severity 4. It's also going to allow you to send notifications. We'll see that in the demo in a second, as well as build complex actions. So here, this is a logic app, all right? You see that it is basically a series of building blocks, if you want, which are connected together. We have tons and tons of connectors. We'll see that in the demo. And it allows you, without any programming experience, I would say, to be able to say, all right, this is what I want to happen. This is a workflow that I want to happen when I have an alert in my application. So let's talk about notifications and complex action in a demo. So this is back to our rewards application. And here what we really would like to do is be notified when the site goes down for any reason, when we have some 404 or any type of error like that, really. So let's go to the portal. I'm going to go here into application insights again. Let's go into the data, and we are going to use here the availability dashboard. All right, so this is where we see the availability. We see that we had already some tests. Everything was successful, 100% availability. So this is really good. A specific test here. I'm going to name that, okay, this is my rewards availability test. Good. This is a ping test, and we can enter the URL that you want to ping. You can either ping the main URL, or you can ping a sub URL. Now you can also parse dependent requests, meaning that if an image or a CSS file, for example, is not found, then you can also get notified. Now we are configuring 5 test locations. You can configure more or less if you want. And you see the test frequency is every 5 minutes, which means that we are going to ping every 1 minute from one of those 5 locations. So we have a 5-minute cycle. We say that if the status code is not equal to 200, then we want to be notified. And this is our availability test that we create. All right, we see that right now everything's working fine. Let's go and open the rules and configure an alert. All right, so here we see that at the moment we have this condition, which means that we will get notified if 2 sites or more fail. And then we are going to create what we call an action group. The action group is going to help you to basically set a set of alerts, and then you can use this action group for different alerts depending what you want to do. So here, first of all, I'm setting here the details for the alert rule, severity 4. All right, going to go back here, create a new action group. And here I'm going to say what this action group is going to do, what notifications it's going to send. So like everything else, it is created inside the resource group. I'm going to give it a name. All right, we have an actual name, and then we have a display name. And the next step is to set up which notifications I want to send. So we are going to start with something simple. We are going to say notify the owner of this Azure resource. All right, so let's go and take a role. We want to take the owner roles. Those are just predefined roles that we have. And then I'm going to say, all right, when this happens, I want the role to be notified because we know the email address of the owner. Okay. Next notification, I want to be notified as well. And I'm going to use an email first. So I'm going to enter here my email, my work email. All right. But you know, emails, I don't know for you, but I don't really have notifications for email on my phone because I get really a lot of emails. There is a risk that it's lost. And this is why I also want to set an Azure push notification. Notice that you could also send an SMS or even a voice message if you want for accessibility. I'm going to say, all right, this is the account that I am logged into my Azure app with. All right, I'm using here the Azure app on Android. You can use it on iOS as well. I'm going to give a name to this group of notifications here. All right, and now I will say, in addition to that, I will complex workflow. So let's go into actions. And here I want to select a logic app that I already created, but I could also select other things, for example, a runbook, Azure function, any kind of webhook really is going to work. And here the logic app, I already created it. It's a simple logic app with an HTTP trigger, and it is called rewards availability. So as you can see, it has been through the resource group. So let's select OK. And we are going to give a name to this rule. And then we will go into the logic app and we will say what the logic app actually does. All right, at this point, I can review and create this action group. All right, it is ready. And for the logic app, what we want to do is have the whole team to be notified if something happens. And the team shows we have actually a tool for that. We have Microsoft Teams, all right? And this is one of the many connectors that you can use into a Logic app. So we are going to do that. First of all, we enable here the rule like this. It is, all right? But the Logic app is not ready yet. So let's go back to our Logic app here. And as you can see, I'm starting with an HTTP request, all right? This is a trigger for the Logic app if you wish. Here we see the URL. But it's okay because it has been found. And then we need some payload. We need the information about what happened. Now, in order to get the payload, I found this documentation page. All right, so make sure to write down here. You will get the slides, of course, and everything at the end. Let's go and select what happens when the request is received. And here I'm going to say I have two possible scenarios. First of all, the status went back to normal. All right, so here I see that the whole information has been parsed by the Logic app. It's a JSON payload. I go and say the status, that's the information that I want to get. And if the status is equal to deactivated, it means that the alert went back to normal. All right, so in that case, if it is true, I'm going to add an action. And for this action, I'm going to choose Microsoft Teams. Again, it's one of the many connectors that we have. Into Teams, I'm going to say I want to send a message to a specific channel in a specific team. So let's go and select the ID of the teams that I want to use. All right, these are all the teams that I have access to with my tenant. And by the way, I had to log into Teams in the demo. You didn't see that because it was not super important, but I had to do that. Then inside this team, we have different channels. So I'm going to select the channels that I want to use. This is something that has to do with this application. And then I can enter a complex message. For example, here I'm going to set this to bold. I'm going to say, all right, this is back to normal. And what is back to normal? Well, again, from the JSON information that was by Logic app, I can get the resource name. For example, like this, we know which resource went back to normal. Let's save that. And now we are going to specify what we do when the status is not deactivated, meaning that the alert fired. So again, we want to send a Teams message, but we can also do a lot of things. We have hundreds and hundreds of connectors, as you can see, a lot of those. Some of them are first-party Microsoft connectors, but we also have some third-party connectors. We even support things like SAP or Gmail, for example, as you can see here. So the whole Google suite, all right? Now, in my case, I want to use Microsoft Teams. So let's go back here. I'm going to select the post a message feature of Teams. All right, let's find it. It is a little bit higher. Here we go. And then I will select again the team ID. All right, in that case, it's going to be the same team and the same channel. And this time I want to enter a little bit more information than before because this is an alert. So I'm going to say there is a problem with a specific resource, all right? So there is an issue, and then I'm selecting the resource that has the issue. Let's put that in bold. I could even put it in red in order to make sure that people see it, all right? The resource name again. And then later, I'm going to add also the context of the error, which is a big JSON block. And if I did that really in production, I would probably parse the JSON block again. You can do that in the Logic app very easily. But in that case, for the sake of time, I'm just going to copy the whole context information. And you will see it's not very easy to read that. It's just a big JSON block, basically. But it's already going to give me a lot of information about what went on in my alert. Okay, so now my Logic app is ready. I'm going to enable it. And like this, really, everything is hot. All right, the alert, the action group is hot. At the moment, nothing happened. That's cool. But let's simulate a failure. And in order to do that, I will go to my web application. And I am very simply going to just turn it off. So it is really a full-on simulation of something went wrong. All right, let's stop the web application. And now, after a short moment, all right, it takes a couple of minutes for the alert to fire because, again, we are monitoring. We don't want to fire every time that some small things happen. But after a short wait, if we go into Microsoft Teams, we will see that we have a problem. So here we have the availability dashboard. We see that the availability is down. All right, some tests have failed. That's really bad. We see the location where it failed from. Actually, in that case, all 5 locations that we set up have failed. So we really have a problem. It means that something went really, really bad. All right. We see that in Teams that we received the message. It was posted in my name because I'm logged into Azure. And we see the full context. And even better, in the Azure application running here on Android, but you can also run it on iOS, we see that we have a notification, push notification. I can go and open the app, see what alert we got. Severity 4 is what I set. We see which resource has fired. So we have a problem with Tailwind rewards on Azure. Well, actually, one thing which is cool here is that I can go and check it out directly in my app. And so this is the application. This is a resource in question. And we see immediately that it is stopped. So the first thing that I want to do is restart it, and then we'll see what happens. All right, we'll continue monitoring. After a short wait, it went back to normal in Teams. So it's good that I get this notification. My team can be okay, go back to resume their activities over the weekend. And after a while, of course, I will continue to monitor my application and see if everything went well. All right, so what did we see in this module? We talked about quite a few components. We talked about Azure Monitor, which is really where you monitor everything about your application. And then we dived into a part of Azure Monitor, which is Application Insights, more aimed at the application itself, but you saw that we are also monitoring the whole request and we are correlating that. We have also log analytics, which allows you to make sense of complex logs and really a lot of information here. And then we used a snapshot debug in order to debug in production using Visual Studio Enterprise. But even if you don't have Visual Studio Enterprise, it's always good to turn it on because you saw that we collect really a lot of information. Finally, we also acted with notifications on my phone, per email, per SMS, and also complex notifications with Logic apps. In our case, we use Microsoft Teams, but you could also send notifications to a ticketing system, for example. So if you want to know more about this session, this is where you can go to get the slides, the links to different resources, and really everything you can think of, aka.ms/mod50. I really hope that this session was interesting for you and that you had fun watching it. This is the end of the learning part. Thank you so much for watching. So this was the last module of part 2 of this course. This is also the last module of the course overall. So let's just recap quickly what we learned in this course. First of all, we talked about assessing your migration. This is what you do before you even get started. This is what gives you peace of mind. And once we have assessed the web application migration itself, we have assessed the data migration. We even did a quick assessment of the .NET migration in case you want to migrate to a newer version of .NET. After that, we talked in module 2 about migrating the web application itself to the cloud. We saw Azure Migrate, we saw how it works. And then in module 3, we did the data migration. At this point, we had everything into the cloud. We also talked about other data solutions on Azure. And then we went on with the part 2 with module 4, where we talked about configuring your web application, securing it, using custom domain. Now, in the modules that we just saw, which was module 5, we talked about monitoring your web application, Azure Monitor. We also talked about debugging in production. And hopefully you see that on Azure, we have the tools that will help you to really tune your application so that it has the best performance, the best also cost management for you. So this is the end of part 1 and part 2. Thank you so much for attending. This is a Microsoft Azure Virtual Training Days. We talked about modernizing .NET application. Now, I want you to remember that you have really a lot of ways to keep learning on Azure. And for example, Microsoft Learn, we have a lot of modules where you can go through a self-learning pace and prepare yourself for certification if you want to take one. Thank you so much for attending, and remember to keep learning always.